Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 7th of April for our first panel session today on the work of the Department for Business and Trade. The Department for Business and Trade was created in February 23, bringing together parts of the former Department of International Trade and the former Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, so-called BEIS, to create a single department for economic growth. In January 25, the department published its first set of accounts for 23-4, 10 months after the year end. The CNAG qualified his audit opinion due to the issues with data and in breach of spending limits in relation to the Post Office Horizon compensation schemes, which was set up to compensate postmasters, I suppose oblique mistresses, affected by the failings of the Horizon IT systems at the Post Office and associated miscarriages of justice. Another area of financial risk for the department is the bounce-back loan scheme, which was introduced to support small businesses during the pandemic. The previous committee found that the scheme had exposed the taxpayer to potentially huge losses, and the department's accounts show that the fraud for loss for this scheme is currently estimated at 1.9 billion. So today we will question the department on its management of Horizon compensation schemes, examine its progress on recovering losses on the bounce-back business loans, and its plans for improving the timeliness of accounts. So, to help us with all that, we're delighted to welcome today Gareth Davies, CBE, Permanent Secretary at the Department for Business and Trade. Gareth has been in this role since creation of the department in February 23. Welcome, Gareth, Permanent Secretary. Also accompanying him is Tara Smith, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Department for Business and Trade. Tara has been in this role since July 23. And finally, but no means least, Carl Creswell, Director of Post Office Policy and Business Engagement at the Department for Business and Trade. And you've been in your role since June 24?
Actually, 2019, April, in the previous department.
In BEIS, yes.
Exactly.
But in this role, you were previously Director of Business Resilience. You're now Director of Post Office Policy, is that correct?
Post Office has been a golden thread since 2019, and I've covered other things along the way.
Okay. Well, anyway, thank you very much for that. And we're also pleased to welcome as a guest on this committee today Charlie Maynard, who's a member of the Business and Trade Committee. So without any further ado, let us launch into a few questions on those matters that we've talked about, and we're going to ask to start with Rachel. Clive, sorry, you ready?
Yes.
Clive, sorry.
Yeah.
Why have I got my list wrong? This is the main lot, isn't it?
Horizon's obviously been a very big issue. I think many people in the country aren't aware of it as a significant problem, but it's a problem that has led to the CNAG qualifying your accounts. Mm-hmm. It's not a happy situation, is it? And essentially that's because I don't think there's any confidence in the estimates you've done about what the likely level of claims are going to be, both in terms of volume and settlements. Mm-hmm. When are we going to be clear about that?
Yeah, so look, this is, and thank you for the question. Obviously, the Horizon compensation payments is a critical priority for the department, but over the last year, but as my colleague Carla says, for many years in the department now. I mean, this is an incredibly complex set of schemes, interlocking schemes. As you know, there are 4 different schemes at different levels of maturity. The big change last year was twofold. Firstly, the introduction of the Horizon Compensation Repayment Scheme. This was just in January, which covered just over 800 people who had their convictions quashed by the 2024 Act. We had a minimum amount paid of £600,000, but obviously some of the potential liabilities could be far larger than that. The second issue was around the Horizon schemes, which is around the shortfall payments. The uncertainties which were then reflected in the CAG's limitations were essentially on 2 issues. On the shortfall schemes, it was a volume question. To date, we've paid over 5,000 people, either interim or final payments. There's a question of how many people will come forward. What this government has done is proactively ask the Post Office to proactively write out to postmasters who may have been affected before it was demand-led, so we want to make sure we are reaching as many people as possible. That creates large uncertainty in quite what the take-up rates of those letters will be. In terms of the number of people contacted, already just shy of 10,000, likely to double over the coming weeks and months. As you get further from people who have been significantly affected, the take-up rates are obviously very unclear. So there's large uncertainty on the volumes. We know the value because if you look at the experience through HSS, 98% of people have taken the minimum amount, the £75,000, which was brought in to provide a quick and rapid route or a quicker and more speedier route to settlement. So HSS, the uncertainty there is on volumes. On HCRS, which is that 840 people who've had their convictions overturned by the 2024 Act, the question there is about the value. Because obviously their cases are far more complex and the spread of potential payments far greater, it's harder to estimate the actual value. And the question here is, what proportion of those affected, we know the volume, but what proportion of those affected will take the minimum payment of 600,000? There's a range of estimates that we've been working on with the NAO, with the Post Office, but of course the scheme is still new and we haven't had any experience to be able to guide us. If you look back to the overturned conviction schemes, for people who don't take the 600,000, the average payment is, I think, 1.17 million. So that gives you just a sense of the range. So that's reasons why we had the limitations this time round. What I'll be looking for is as the schemes mature and we get more experience, we'll be able to narrow that bound of uncertainty and hopefully be able to provide more assurance to the NAO.
Right. How quickly will it narrow?
That'll depend on two things. As we get on HSS, as we get responses back to the letters that are being written out now. And then on HCRS, the scheme for the 840, that will depend on as we start to see settlements coming through. On HSS, I'll be confident that bound will start to narrow over this financial year, 25-26. So you may still have limitations on last year's accounts. On HCRS, I think that will take longer. I might ask Carl to come in a minute, but that will be longer. So, I mean, it's ultimately for the controller to decide on the limitations, but this is a complex, highly unusual scheme with large variability in payments.
Yes.
The HSS and the letters that have gone out, that's right, and they're basically simpler claims but a lot more people. Right. Are we relying on the Post Office to resolve this? Because they haven't got a great track record on resolving things in this matter, have they?
There were different aspects to the challenge around HSS. The Post Office is the organisation that's been writing out to people to say to them the scheme is still open and to encourage people to apply. They have the contact details, they have that past relationship. But ministers have had some concern about whether claimants are happy with the settlements under the Horizon Shortfall Scheme, and they have committed to launch an appeals system to be run by this department, and ministers will be announcing the details of that and opening it for applications soon. So the first contact point to postmasters who might be eligible is coming through the Post Office. There is then an independent panel that looks at claims from those individuals, and then if they've had a full assessment, in future they will be able to come to DBT for an assessment.
Right, but the Post Office is doing the writing out. Is it doing the chasing up as well?
Yes, it's doing the writing out and contacting people. Yeah.
I know they're doing the initial writing out. How enthusiastic are they about doing the chasing up?
So far, the results seem to have been pretty successful. We've had thousands of people come in since the letters have been issuing.
When were the letters issued? Because I came across a lady just randomly knocking on doors about 6 weeks ago who wasn't aware that she might be eligible. She'd worked for the Post Office for 30 years. So when did those letters go out?
They started issuing in about September time last year, and they have been issuing on a rolling basis. In some cases, the Post Office didn't have contact details because of it was a family member on behalf of someone who had died or an estate. And so in some cases, letters have issued much more recently, including last month. And as the Permanent Secretary was saying, more letters will issue soon.
See whether she's had a letter now. Yeah.
How many replies have been received to the letters sent out?
So far, it's about 25% of the letters that have issued have had responses. So I think you mentioned the number of people that have had letters, which was about 18,000. And so far, about 25% of people have responded to those letters.
And how many have had a chase up?
I don't believe the Post Office has sent any chasers. I think they have done a one-off letter to those individuals. On the Horizon Convictions Redress Scheme, the various justice authorities have issued letters, and we are discussing with them at the moment the merits of sending a follow-up letter. there is a bit of a judgment about whether individual people might feel that they were being harassed if they had a series of letters asking them the same thing. So there is a bit of a judgment about how many times do you need to contact someone to say, why have you not applied? May I just add to the point that you were mentioning earlier about the numbers for HCRS, because I think it does show that we have been making some progress. So of the around 800 people that might end up in the scheme, 536 people have applied so far, and 339 have accepted the fixed sum of £600,000. So quite a big proportion have already come back, and the claimant lawyers are indicating to me that it will be probably about 85% of people in that cohort, the people whose convictions were overturned by Parliament, who will accept the 600,000. So that will give us more certainty. The full claims are unlikely to come to us until summer, early autumn, according to the claimant lawyers, and the reason for the delay is that they want to seek external evidence.
The Department's got complete oversight of that process.
Exactly.
Back to the HSS, are you not sort of suggesting to the Post Office that only 25% of people have replied after several weeks? It might not be a bad idea just to give them a reminder, because otherwise this thing's just going to drag on and on and on, isn't it?
We can reflect on that view, balancing it with what I was saying earlier about not wanting to to be seen to be pestering people. I mean, I don't think in any world we would expect all 100% of the people to whom they are writing to respond, because they are writing to everyone who was a postmaster throughout that period, and it's unlikely that 100% of people would have suffered a shortfall throughout that period.
I think you make a very pertinent point. I mean, my reflection on this, and to be tested, we'll take that to the Horizon Compensation Advisory Board, because there is a delicate judgment around, as my colleague says, around making sure people don't feel that we're sort of chasing them too much, but making sure we're reaching them at the same time. So we'll take that to the Advisory Board. Thank you.
And is there a cut-off point when for claims to be received?
No, the advisory board that the Permanent Secretary mentions has suggested that we should keep the HSS open for now. Part of the reason for that has been that there's been a surge of interest ever since the ITV drama and documentary were launched. The rate is actually slowing a bit now, but ministers have said that they won't take a view quite yet. So Wyn Williams, who's running the Horizon IT inquiry, has suggested that we should set a closure date. But again, there's a balance to be struck there when claims are still coming in and letters are still to issue. It seems a bit early to close the scheme.
Just finally, to sort of put this part of the to bed, one of the reasons the CNAG qualified his accounts was over the potential number of claimants and the proportion of claimants that will choose the £600,000 fixed sum offer. Are you likely to be able to resolve that problem before next year's accounts, or this year's accounts need to be all audited?
I come
through and I'll.
Yeah, I mean, my view on the proportion for HCRS is that it will be clearer in the next couple of months. So certainly by the summer, because we are getting a lot of applications in at the moment, I think we will proportionally have quite confident numbers. The issue is we don't quite know what the amount that will be claimed for that smaller proportion of the 800. So there is still going to be some uncertainty about the value, but I personally feel more confident that we will have a better forecast as a result of the high numbers that have come in recently.
Very helpful answer. Thank you very much. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Creswell, we are nearly, so in the report and accounts that we are looking at, there's provisions at note 15, which includes an £883 million provision for postmaster redress. We're now obviously nearly a year, or over a year actually, since that provision was made. How are those outgoing payments progressing against that provision?
Of course, no, thank you. So we have now paid out around £892 million to 6,200 people using the end of March figures. So that has been quite a significant increase. It's 3.5 times the amount that had been paid out by the end of June.
Can I just quickly ask, so you had made a provision of 883. You've now paid out 892, but is there still more to pay out? So
There certainly is, and the Chancellor did confirm to Parliament that the estimate was around 1.8 billion. I think it was 1.75 billion rounded. And the reason for the difference has been both the changes to the number of people who might apply for HSS, so the decision to offer the £75,000 and write out to thousands of postmasters, and also the Horizon Convictions Redress Scheme that followed the overturning of the legislation. So the provision that you mentioned was written at a time before Parliament had intervened.
So I just want to make sure I've got the right number here, though. That 883 has now gone up to 1.78 billion, although obviously events, but that's the correct comparator.
Yeah, so £1.75 billion rounded, and that includes, I should say, claimants' legal fees of around 100 million. So the bases are slightly different, but it's about 107 million of that 1.75 billion as claimants' legal fees, and then the rest is redress across the different schemes.
So I accept that the overturning the convictions is obviously a political decision that was made after this provision was put into the accounts, but there still seems to be quite a considerable amount that could have been predicted in terms of being required for redress that you haven't included in this 883.
Well, 862 of that 1.75 billion comes from the Horizon Convictions Redress Scheme.
Okay.
So if you were to remove that from the 1.75 billion, it would take you down
to a lot closer to 883.
Yes, it would.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. Obviously, Department for Business and Trade are now taking over the administration of the overturned conviction scheme, and that's obviously following requests from the victims of the scandal. But that will happen in June. What do you think will be the impact for victims in particular of the department taking over the administration?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a change that has followed comments from the victims, but also from the Business and Trade Select Committee, who have encouraged us to play a more active role in it. We're in a transition period. DBT takes on ownership of the scheme on the 3rd of June, so we're trying to make sure that there's continuity of service. There are 111 people in the cohort, so these are people whose convictions were overturned by the courts prior to the legislation. The Post Office is still waiting for 25 people within that group to submit full claims. So one of the differences that I hope we will see is that claimants will feel more comfortable at engaging with the process and submitting claims, because we obviously can't provide offers to people unless they actually submit claims. And the claimants' lawyers tell me that quite a large number of those 25 people are quite vulnerable and are struggling to engage with the process.
Can I just quickly ask, so 111 in the cohort, 25 not submitted claims, so there's nothing to stop you progressing the remaining claims?
That's right. So there are 86 of the 111 who have submitted claims. 78 of them have received offers from the Post Office. So there is a gap there of 8 between the two, and they're still waiting for the Post Office to issue offers. And then 70 people have accepted offers. So I hope that we will see more people submit their claims. And to be honest, some of the claimant lawyers have said to me that we shouldn't expect to see claims until early 2026, in part because victims want to wait until the Horizon inquiry completes its work.
Makes sense.
I would also say I think that a lot of the people who have accepted offers have been those who are happy with the 600,000 fixed sum. So we will be inheriting the more complex cases where people are more vulnerable, more medical expert evidence is needed, and so on. So I hope that we will be able to break the back of it this year, and we'll be working with people like Sir Gareth Hickinbottom, who have been praised by the Business and Trade Select Committee for helping with case management. But we are inheriting quite a sort of sticky tail, you might say, of the claims under that scheme.
I interrupted you when you were talking about the 25 who haven't submitted claims. You were saying that they were more vulnerable claimants.
Yes, what claimants' lawyers have said to me is that they are struggling to get instructions to use their language from those claimants, partly because some of them have said, I can only think of one thing at a time, so I can engage with the Horizon inquiry, and then once that is done, I will submit my claims. And others, frankly, are struggling with mental health problems caused by the horrific scandal many years ago, even now, and we see that through the medical reports that come through. So there are various reasons, but we are in contact with the lawyers in advance of us taking on ownership for the scheme, and I am confident that we will have more claims come through for the OC scheme during this year. I just can't promise that they will all come in, and it's a bit of a demand-led system. So as soon as we get them in, we will provide offers within 40 working days in line with the service level agreement we're applying to the GLO scheme that we already are running.
Just thinking about that purely from the perspective of needing to produce accounts, how easy will it be to have a provision for those 25 cases, given how complex and difficult it is to I guess it's going to be very challenging to have an estimate of how much that eventual liability is going to be.
I think it will still be quite challenging. Obviously, the number's smaller, so a bit like I was saying on HCRS, when you get further through a scheme, it becomes simpler because the variation in the averages, if it was 1 million or 2 million, is less impactful if it's 25 people out of 111 than if it were half of that, 111. So it will be, I think, easier on the overturned conviction side, and I think the NAO's concerns were primarily around the HSS and the HCRS last time around, rather than the OC scheme.
And just finally, how effectively are you working with the Post Office to effect this transfer?
It's been very positive so far. We had engaged with them for a while before it was announced. We have signed all the various documents that we need, such as disclosure, so that we can get hold of the information we need from the Post Office. And as I said, we're partway through a 3-month transition, and all signs are positive. We have good relationships with the claims lawyers already because we've been working with them for a number of years.
Mr. Davies, the department's provided a letter of support to Post Office Limited, confirming that the department continue to provide financial support to enable it to meet its liabilities as they fall due for a period of no less than 15 months from December 2024. It feels like a bit of a blank cheque, if I may suggest. What conditions are attached to that?
Yeah, so this is a rolling working capital requirement that we manage. Been done historically. There's been continual repayment of that working capital requirement over that time. The assurance we have over that essentially is twofold. Within the department, my colleague Carl and his team work day in, day out with the management team of the Post Office, including the Chair, Chief Exec, to understand sort of exactly how that was used. We then also bring in UK GI, UK government investments, to provide assurance around the financial structures, and they give the assurance for me to be able to sign off the working capital requirement.
And to what extent are you expecting the Post Office or Post Office Limited to need to draw on this letter of support?
I do expect them to. They use this every year, but then essentially it's a revolving financing or provision from the department for its working capital.
But are you confident that Post Office Limited is financially sustainable, even though it needs to draw on this letter of support?
Yes, as I say, this letter of support is a historic structure of financing between the department and the Post Office. Has happened over multiple years, so this is not something new in this financial year. It's been an ongoing way in which they fund their operations and repay over the course of the year. So on that base, in terms of short-term liquidity, yes, because like I say, I've got the assurance coming through from UK GI, who act as my commercial advisors. There is a longer question around the long-term financial viability of the Post Office, which you quite rightly sort of hint at. As you know, with the falling volumes and usage of the Post Office network, that makes it incredible. You know, they need the network subsidy, which we continue to provide. As part of the work of both the new chair and also through the spending review preparations, we are looking in the round about the policy objectives that we want from the Post Office. So in other words, why we are funding the Post Office, why we're providing a subsidy, what's the most cost-efficient way of being able to do that in terms of value for money for the taxpayer, and make sure that we can put the Post Office onto that long-term footing.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Two questions arising for me from what Sarah Olney has been asking you. It's firstly these 25 people who are vulnerable under the scheme where their convictions have been overturned, so there's a legal process already been undertaken. Is there any provision within that to pay them a substantial interim payment?
Yes, every one of those people that I mentioned, the 25, has received at least £200,000 as an interim payment, which the NAO mentioned as an example of good practice, paying interim payments when it did its recent report on compensation schemes. So they have at least had that amount of money. When a claimant submits a full claim, and I recognise those 25 have not yet, they receive £450,000, which acts as the minimum payment, and then their claim will progress through full assessment. So they have had some money along the way.
How will that claim proceed to full assessment? I mean, are we going to find some of them are going to end up back in the courts or not? Or are you pretty sure you're going to be able to settle them somehow?
So my hope is that we can settle all of them through the compensation schemes, but they have been set up in that legal context, as you acknowledge, where the claimant could choose to go to a court if they were unhappy with the offer. We really hope that won't happen, and as I mentioned earlier, we've employed Sir Gary Hickinbottom, who, a former judge who holds case management hearings and tries to crack through areas of disagreement between the claimant and the post office, or in future the department. So I feel confident, but I can't rule out the fact that some individuals, as we did here in relation to the GLO scheme recently, may say that they would like to have their day in court and take the post office to court rather than participate within the compensation scheme.
What? Just finally on Ms. Olney's other question about the letter of assurance. Why did you go down that route rather than the contingency liability route, which would have given, I think, claimants a greater assurance that they were going to get the money that was owed to them? Why did you go down that route?
Sorry, the letter of assurance is not about the compensation payments. So that all the compensation payments are in the contingent liabilities. And of course, this government has shifted the payments of those compensation payments into AMI, as in annual managed, rather than our budget. So before we had a whole complex reconciliation thing. But that's all in the contingent liabilities. Letter of assurance is on the working capital for the post office operation. Sorry, so apologies, I should have been clearer. That is about the operation of the post office rather than the it's not zero impact on.
Very helpful clarification. Thank you very much, Ms. Davies. Right, we now come, please, to Charlie Maynard, our guest on the committee today.
Thank you, Chair. So talking about bounce back loan scheme, so stop me where I go wrong here, but so we've got, as of 31st March 24, we've got 1.941 billion of, and I'm going to estimate of lifetime fraud and error. Acknowledges the actual rate amount is going to be quite a lot higher than that, likely as it outturns. But in terms of actually what we're getting back in at the moment, we're getting scheme funds recovered were £8.6 million in 23-24. So we've got nearly 2 billion out of fraud and error, and we're getting back 8 million. So a tiny amount getting back in. And I just want to kind of try and take that apart. So as per the note you very kindly came out with very quickly, there's 3 tiers. I'm talking about bottom of page 6, top of page 7. The approach included prioritising the fraud response by grouping the loans into 3 tiers. The top tier, which is over 100k, is dealt with by enforcement agencies, but all of these loans are under 50k, so therefore they're being left with the lenders to deal with, investigate mid-tier and bottom-tier fraud. The problem is the lenders have got a full guarantee from the government, so they've got no incentive to go and fish for this money. It's £2 billion, and so this is kind of evidenced by almost no money is coming back into the government of that 2 billion per year, and so we've got a big problem. And so, and then it says, what's the plan for maximising the recovery of the fraud and error loss? And it says, programme activity is 3 core pillars: data and analytics programme, tackling fraud through lenders and tackling fraud through enforcement partners, which doesn't tell us much. So what are we going to do back as much of it as possible? Yeah. And what are clever ways of aligning incentives?
Of how we are working with the lenders, with the Bank of England, Treasury and others, UK Finance, to make sure these are aligned. Because often, even when it has been issued in terms of fraud and people have gone backward, we are able to recoup some of this money. But in terms of just the overall numbers, just sort of wanted to step back on some of these numbers, because it is important to sort of look at the sort of broader context. I mean, bounce back loans were a large intervention in the middle of COVID. That was best part of £47 billion intervention. I mean, to date, we've got a repayment already of best part of £20 billion. Now, you should say, so there'll be provisions for, so a lot of these losses will be don't be about fraud and error. The vast majority of that will be when companies have failed over this period. So we sort of see, in terms of the actual payments to date, most of these, around 14 billion, are due to company failure rather than fraud. So that's sort of the heart of it. And we are expecting a lot of this to be recouped over coming years. We've made a provision in the accounts for further losses because of the collapse of the companies. But the focus on the, sort of the actual fraud element, whilst the incentives aren't there because of the way in which the guarantees work. In other British business bank schemes, typical guarantees are around about, say, the 70% level on things like Enable and the like. This is 100%, but we have worked through with the banks and have been able to actually recoup some of that despite the 100%. But Tara, I don't know if you want to come on the detail.
So I would say, first of all, of the original loan guarantees, 75% of those are either being paid back or paying according to schedule. But you're quite right. Of the remaining guarantees that are outstanding at the date of these accounts, we had loan guarantees of about £26 billion in these accounts, of which we have provided another £6 billion again. So that's our expected losses, of which we have said 1.9 billion of that we are estimating currently to be fraudulent. So there's a number of areas. There's probably 3 different ways that we are tackling this. One, we have an in-house fraud team, who are the team in DBT who are overseeing all of the counter-fraud activity. The first and primary responsibility for chasing fraud are the lenders. And British Business Bank also then do an audit and assurance process, monitoring the performance of how that is going. So that's they meet monthly. There's a board that reviews that, where DBT, British Business Bank, Treasury and Cabinet Office are on that board. I would say when they're going through that quality assurance process, we do withdraw any guarantees where we think that the lenders aren't doing what they're supposed to do, which is follow up on this fraudulent activity. And actually, we've withdrawn £1.1 billion worth of guarantees. So that's one way of incentivising lenders. So we are quality assuring their work, and where we don't feel like they have done what they're due to do, which is follow up on all of these, trying to recover any fraudulent activity, we withdraw the guarantee. And then we also have, we outsource the most complex cases as well to a provider to follow up on the most extreme and serious cases of fraud. Those things take a long time to go through because they're very complex, very detailed. They end up in courts, so that does take a while for that to actually appear as a recovery. But you will notice in the accounts as well that we have recovered £140 million to date of fraudulent payments. So that's where we are, and we are continuing to work through this. So we are not taking our feet off the pedal on this one. We have a number of different ways that we are trying to make sure we're following up with the best of our ability on these fraudulent cases.
Sorry, could you just kind of connect how that 140 connects with that 8.6? So the 8.6 is the BBLS funds recovered 23-24, and it's got the previous 2 years, which add up to 15.9. So you mentioned 140. So does the 140 relate to BBLS or something else?
140 are the recoveries to date across the four COVID schemes. Okay,
so but BBLS it's only 15.9.
15.9.
Sorry, this is the 7-pager that we received just today, and that's got BBLS funds recovered. It goes 21, 22, 22, 23, 23, 24. So that comes to 16 million quid. So and as I understand it, BBLS is where all the fraud, the great majority of the fraud is had.
Yes.
So what we've still got, well done on the other ones, but this is the problem one, and what I'm worried about is there's no incentive for the lenders to. I mean, I'm being a little bit harsh maybe, but they're guaranteed, yeah. So we've got £2 billion and climbing, and we're not getting any of that money back, and so I mean it's great to hear there's process, but the process isn't yielding much fruit. So what I think would be good is if we had a plan to say, and frankly we could, I think, be a bit radical about saying, well, hey lenders, you can get some of this money if you get some of it back, because getting 100% of zero is not going to do us any good. Whereas if we got, if they got a percentage as well or whatever, but there's got to be some sort of incentive to get that 2 billion back.
So I think we are continuing to chase down this fraud, and as I said, with the lenders, with this assurance process that we have a monthly board that reviews this, working with lenders.
Numbers are terrible.
The numbers have improved, and so
2 billion, 8.
So I'm not too sure, but we can take it away about how much more we can do with lenders. But BBB and this board are looking at all opportunities and how we can actually recover this fraud. And I think working with agencies to make sure that we are thinking about how we are actually managing this in the future. But I would say that we have got pretty good governance, data analytics, to try and maximise our returns on this fraudulent activity, which we knew at the outset when these loans were actually going out, where we had a ministerial direction, because we knew there was going to be a high...
There's a difference between failure of businesses and fraud. These are not the failure of businesses. This is the fraud and the error. Yeah, so these are the ones we really do want to be going after. We're being ripped off. So, and respectfully, if you may have great governance and everything else, but if the results are tiny, and it is tiny, then something's not working.
As I said, I think we asked where we're still on recovery for many of the loans, but I do take your point on how we can actually work with BBB on how more we can do, what more we can do on recovering some of that fraudulent debt that we've estimated in the accounts.
On the 1.1 billion guarantees withdrawn, what does that actually cover? Does that cover just fraudulent cases? Does it cover businesses that have gone out of business? What does it cover?
The 1
billion guarantees
withdrawn.
Yes.
That's where the lenders... So the primary responsibility is for lenders to seek recovery of any of those loans that have gone bad or are deemed to be fraudulent. Where BBB, through this process where they are looking at data and analytics and doing a post-audit claims review, where it's been found that lenders haven't actually done their activity as we expected them to do, we withdraw the guarantee. So therefore, we do not have to cover those loans.
So in terms of the incentive, back to your question, that is a sharp incentive back on the lender. Because you're right, with 100% guarantee, because of the nature of how it was set up, it sounds like, well, if I was a bank, I'd just sort of passport it through and the taxpayer can pick up the tab. The way we give it some edge here, and it's not perfect because you'd like to have had that designed in, hence the ministerial direction, as Tara says, but the way we give it edge now is by removing the guarantees if we are when we have reviewed and said, you know what, you're not following, these weren't issued in the right way. So that does give it some bite. I'm not suggesting that I'm comfortable with where all these numbers are, because these are big, whilst COVID schemes are big, mega tens of billions interventions, the numbers we're still talking about in terms of the runoff are material in terms of taxpayer interest.
Whilst the previous work the previous committee in the previous Parliament did on this whole business was we found quite a difference in the performance of the lenders' efforts to seek recovery, and that is presumably contained within that figure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that work was certainly a good prompt or a catalyst for certainly the work that the BBB has done with Treasury to go through and use both, as Tara says, the analytics, but also then actually just removing cover. Removing cover is the simplest lever we've got, but of course we've got to do that in a proportionate way, because it wouldn't be right then to remove cover from banks in approach this in good faith. I think fundamentally, if you like, the original sin here is the scheme design and the way in which it was set up. And that's not to sort of say nothing can be done now, but of course you're on the back foot given the way the scheme was designed at the point. Recognise, but of course understanding the context of the macroeconomy at the point, and the real worry at the time of the number of businesses that might be going under. And if you look at the BBB's estimates of the number of businesses that are being supported through this scheme, it had an incredibly positive, I think up to around about 500,000 businesses they think have been sustained as a result of that intervention. So it was a difficult time, I think we have to recognise, but the scheme design does not help in terms of tackling fraud and error.
If I may, I mean, look, I completely agree with that. I'm not arguing any. It'd be helpful just kind of to ask for a note or something to say, okay, so we've got 2 billion outstanding and it's climbing. This is what DBT wants. saying, here are the options as to what we think we could do, and this is what we recommend. Or
very happy to provide a note for the committee, and if members would be interested, we're happy to brief separately on that one and just go through the details, maybe with Louis Taylor from the British Business Bank as well.
We had such a briefing before.
Oh, perfect.
And I'm grateful for the offer, Gareth. Can we sort of take that away in the committee, and we may well want to come back to you on that. Did you want to ask further questions on registrations?
Well, just yes, thank you. Just understanding identifiers in terms of this was all done in a hurry, and therefore, whether it would be helpful for the DBT to be asking the lenders what information they have about the individuals behind the companies that took out these loans. Because if I was to ask for a loan and go, my ID is ABC123, just how much of this is false, and trying to kind of understand that, because that's a way of also, and I don't think that information is inside DBT, but it is with the lenders. So actually asking the lenders for this information and asking for their opinions about duplicity and fraud would be helpful.
Yeah, no, look, well, again, that's exactly the sort of things that the bank is working with the lenders on. I mean, just to provide some assurance, this was a process done at pace in the middle of the crisis, but they were required to do this. Whilst they self-certified their eligibility, they did have to provide the normal ID checks, so the sort of the know your customer checks that came through, they were all done. So in terms of who the individuals are, relative confidence on that. It's much more the scheme eligibility rather than the individual that's the case.
Credit checks were not done, and that was presumably on the basis of time available. Speed, yeah. Okay. Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask about the publication date of the 23-24 accounts? Because they were published 10 months after the end of the financial year. So could you walk us through what were the reasons behind such a late publication date?
Sure, and
shall I take that one?
You're the expert. Why not?
So there's probably three reasons why the accounts were so delayed for 23-24. The first one, it was the first set of accounts for the Department of Business and Trade. So that meant a huge amount of work on bringing together and consolidating for the first time part of what was former BEIS with the Department of International Trade opening balances. And when we talk about opening balances, you actually go back 3 years. And then the level of materiality that we now have in the Department of Business and Trade in comparison to the BEIS accounts is massively different. So in BEIS, it would have been £500 million that those balances had been previously audited. In DBT, they had to be audited at a much higher level of precision, so that's £50 million. And I think actually there's quite extensive disclosure of that from the CNAG on the amount of work and audit work that also took. So for our team to do the work and then for it to be audited, that was a huge endeavour. The second thing I would say, it was a massive learning curve. So the team who did this work were primarily the people that were originally in the Department of International Trade. They had to understand this new complex balances that would come across, like BBB, like Post Office. It was a very steep learning curve. And also, as part of the machinery of government, we didn't always have the people in the team at the beginning, because obviously through the machinery of government, you created 3 departments. In fairness to the other departments, we did have to think about how we actually made sure each department had some capability and capacity. So we've built up that team since then and built up their experience. But that was definitely a steep learning curve for us. And I would say the vast majority of the work was done by September. Between September and January, it was all about the Post Office and Post Office provisions, and what we just discussed at length about how complex it was to actually come up with the provisions, make sure that we could justify the estimates, making sure they aligned with Post Office. It was very difficult, as you can imagine, now that we know that we've got the limitation scope, because we had to use some estimates and we had to look at modelling and try and justify how we're building up those provisions. So there were the 3 reasons really for why the accounts were so delayed.
That's really helpful, thank you. So in terms of the next set of accounts, what's in place to make sure that it doesn't take an extra 10 months? So you talked about being a steep learning curve and that you've built up the team. So what's been put in place to accelerate the process next year?
So I'd say we've done quite significant lessons learned alongside the National Audit Office. The team are now experienced. We've recruited some great capability into the team. So new financial controller, new head of accounts. And also the team who were in place at the time, obviously having gone through it once, they have learnt a lot. So I'm really confident in the capability and the capacity of the team. We've also worked really constructively with the NAO on a very, very detailed timetable. And also that kind of expectations, what do we need to support our balances? So we've got a really good joined up plan now for the 24-25 accounts. But I would say we have a knock-on impact. The fact that our accounts were already laid in January has meant that we've delayed the work that we'd usually do pre-Christmas on planning for the following year's accounts. So I expect this year we're working towards a September laying of our accounts. But we aim to be back in pre-recess for the 25-26 accounts.
You're confident that you've resolved most of the issues, you're just playing catch-up slightly?
Yes, we're playing catch-up. Yeah, there is a knock-on impact from just having to start straight away after laying the accounts in January and start the planning and getting all the work ready in the timetable agreed with NAO for this set of accounts. So September for this year, sadly, but back on pre-recess, hopefully for 25-26.
Yeah, just to build off that point, I do think that's the challenge of a machinery government change like this, and credit to Tara and her team for what the work she's done with NAO. But we created 3 departments from 2. And fundamentally, that is where the capability and capacity is stretched. Certainly, when I've done these sorts of mergers in the private sector, you'd normally have a lot longer to plan. Here, you have literally 24 hours, and so you have those sort of knock-on consequences. And the sort of team that was doing this was effectively the team that were doing the much simpler accounts for the old Department for International Trade, as you've already heard from both the compensation payments and the British Business Bank. The level of complexity of what the balance sheet looks like now compared to what it looked like for the old Department for International Trade is orders of magnitude different.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Great. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Smith, the Government Internal Audit Agency issued a limited assurance opinion on the accounts. Can you explain why that was, and also what the department are doing to respond to that?
Yeah, happy to. So again, I would say a lot of this was down to being the first year's accounts of the Department of Business and Trade. We were building the department, as Gareth mentioned. You don't get much notice of these things. So the internal audit work that would be, when they provide their opinion, they look across the whole of the year. Have you got the right governance in place for the whole of the year? And I'd say that during the year we're building out some of that governance, some of that structures. So the themes that they pulled out in their report were around the machinery of government change. It was around our capacity and capability. We were building a lot of our teams up. We had a lot of vacancies at the beginning of the year. We were working through our governance. That was in place by the end of the year, but it wasn't maybe in place for the whole of the year. We're still trying to build all of that out. There were some themes around strategy and business planning as well. So again, feeling much more confident about the year that we're just about to complete. Obviously, we're working with internal audit, but we have more or less completed all of the internal audit actions that they raised. We've had a full year of being DBT, our governance structures in place. They've completed their internal audit programme. Again, the previous year, their work was disrupted by us being in machinery government, and they had a big end tail for their internal audit programme. That's been completed in a more kind of spaced out during the year. We've had all of our internal audit reviews completed this year. We are working with them now about what does that picture look for the entire year. But I'm feeling much more confident in the position that we have, that we would have hopefully.
Is your expectation that the 2024-25
I'd like to think it would be a moderate, but it is the opinion of the internal auditors in the end of the day, but we are working very constructively with them. And I do think, actually, the limited opinion, it was kind of almost finely balanced, because I think at the end of the year we were moving into moderate, but over that entire year, you would, in fairness, you would, I could understand why they were at a limited assurance for that year.
But there was nothing in that limited opinion that wasn't related to the machinery of government change as far as you're aware?
Other than it was possibly a bit of a distraction at the beginning of the year where we were working very, very quickly to building out the department, building our governance structures, our systems, our processes, that wouldn't have been in place for the entire year. So probably by about July to September, we're in a much better place. But from March to July, we're still kind of working through an interim type model.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I'd almost be worried if internal audit weren't concerned on the back of the scale of the change that happened here, to be honest. The big risk whenever you do a machinery government or a merger is everyone suddenly becomes very internally focused. People are worried about, who they're reporting to, is my job safe? And so the challenge that we had as a leadership team was ensuring that we kept focus on delivering of business for ministers and the public, whilst creating a small team to actually create the right structures, the lines of defence, create a strategic plan for the department. And we essentially built that out of the old Department for International Trade. And you think about the difference between DIT and now the Business and Trade Department. The old Department for Trade were essentially free trade deals, work with the WTO, and investment and export promotion. You kept that, but then added in all the work we're doing on competition policy, regulation, employment law, work that's going on with the steel sector, post office compensation. The bank, the number of partner bodies, for example, went from 1 to 19, just to give you sort of a sense of scale of challenge. And so I think you needed to recruit literally a couple of hundred people into the finance function to provide the capability. So, as I say, over that period, certainly that March to summer recess period, that was a build moment. As we hit the autumn, I personally felt much more confident that whilst the organisation is not without its challenges, the department was more in a steady state position from there on in.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, sir. I've got one final question. On the annual report and accounts, looking at the table of total number of exit packages by cost and brand, page 69, Gareth Davies, please. Yeah. Quite a big package in all of 2.269 million. Is this as large because of the machinery government change, the merger of your department, or was there any other particular reasons?
No, this wasn't actually. This was, that was running into the prior year. In terms of the overall numbers, this is broadly in line with what you might expect over the period. Because remember, this is not just the department, it's the HQ, the Whitehall bit of it. This is all the total civil service reach, so including partner bodies. Just looking here, we had 22 staff exit packages in 23-24. That was at a cost of 961,000, and only one exceeded 100,000 at that point. 11 of those were in the department, and that was mainly staff employed overseas, because we've got 1,500 people based around the world. There were 7 in an agency and 4 in ACAS, or the British Business Bank. And then in addition to that, there were 3 retirements on ill health ground, one of which was in the department, 2 in the insolvency service. And some of that was pension liabilities that were paid up.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. Well, I think, unless Colin's got any more questions, we will come to an end on this session. The clock now stands at 16:26. If we could just be back here we'll give a 5-minute break, sort of 16:32 would be really great, please. So, order, we'll now take you very much. Order. Welcome back to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 7th of April 2025. We now move into our second order of business today as part of our wider scrutiny of the work of the Department of Business and Trade. The Department for Business and Trade is the Department for Growth, which aims to provide more joined-up support for industry to offer a front door for business in order to deliver economic growth across the country. The new government has announced 5 national missions, with the highest priority mission being economic growth. This is part of the mission-driven approach to government, where departments must work together to deliver key priorities in a more effective and efficient way. So last October, the government announced a new industrial strategy to support this growth mission, which is expected to publish in late this spring this year. The government has designed 8 growth-driving sectors, which it believes presents the greatest opportunity for output and productivity growth over the long term. However, delivering this mission and supporting these sectors in an increasingly volatile and economic environment poses a huge challenge for the government. So today we will therefore be questioning senior officials on DBT's current approach to support for priority industry sectors and examine progress made in developing the government's forthcoming industrial strategy. So to help us with that, we are very pleased to welcome Gareth Davies, the Permanent Secretary, back again. And I'm looking for his biography, which is not there, never mind. Sorry, I'm not doing very well with papers today. Well, we've got it here somewhere. And I really hardly need to actually re-announce again, but you have been Permanent Secretary since the creation of the Department in February 2023. We're also very pleased to welcome Jaee. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Kind of you to ask, thank you. It's Jaee Samant.
Jaee Samant. Right. And you are Director of DBT's Business Group, who was appointed in January this year and who is responsible for priority industry sectors.
I am indeed. It's my 3-month anniversary today.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure you'll remember this 3-month anniversary. And also joining you, Permanent Secretary, is David Bickerton, who is the Department's Chief Strategic Business Advisor, who was appointed in January this year and who leads significant business issues for the Department, including commercial opportunities and threats. And finally, and we're pleased to see you, Sean Jones, Director of Companies and Economic Security, and you've been in various roles with HMNT since 2016. A warm welcome to you. Now, Jaee, is it your first time?
I've been to the PAC virtually during COVID some years ago.
That's why I don't remember you. But and Sean, is it your first time?
It is, yes, that's right.
Not you, David, though.
No,
you've been before.
not mine.
Yeah, and obviously. So the two of you, a very warm welcome to the committee for the first time. Thank you for coming today. So I think it's over for me to ask the first question, and I would sort of, just to get us going, Permanent Secretary, how would you evaluate the success of the merger that created DBT from the 2 previous departments? Do you think it's settled down yet, or do you think there's more to go?
Yeah, I mean, touching a bit on our previous session, actually, about the, sort of complexities of the merger, but maybe backing up just a touch into sort of the rationale for the merger from the previous Prime Minister. Because as you'll know, the business department has been through many different iterations over the years, and it's, so it's almost very hard to decide what things should be in the business department, because there's so many issues that touch business, from skills to energy to environmental regulations. So trying to get the right boundary around the business department often depends on the context at the time. I think for me the main rationale for the creation of the department was, and you touched on this yourself, the complex geopolitical environment we're in. I mean, certainly now, but even 2 years ago was the case then, with a sort of increasingly move towards protectionism right the way across the world, a greater interaction between politics and some of the more regulatory decisions that maybe in the 90s and noughties were seen as more technocratic. And for most businesses, it's very hard to split domestic and international issues, which is what had to happen in the old world. So if you speak to someone like John Harrison at Airbus, he would say, prior to the department being created, I needed to go down the road to 1 Victoria Street to speak to the business department, Bays, about domestic support and how we'd operate, the skills need and what was happening in Broughton. Then I'd need to go up the road to the Department for International Trade for advice on market access or how we might negotiate contracts with the Indians. And there was no place that brought a sort of single sense of relationship management with Airbus, which is crazy. So we wanted to make sure that the government should organise itself around businesses' needs rather than the other way around. So for me, the clearest rationale for the department is that integration of the international and the domestic. And in terms of how the merger is going, I mean, I've been involved in multiple machinery government changes in government. I've been involved in mergers in the private sector. These things take longer than you sometimes realise. I think this committee has already looked at, say, the Foreign Office and development. I was in Pricewaterhouse and Coopers and Lybrand, and I think 10 years on, people still said, are you Coopers or are you Pricewaterhouse? It's funny how the legacy happens. Here we did have some wind in our sails, and by that I mean, because the Department for International Trade was a relatively new department, only created in 2017, most of its staff was drawn from the old business department. So I remember on day one when I saw, did the classic town hall and said, how many people have worked in both departments? Something like 70% put up their hands. So you had a strong, similar sort of cultural heritage, training, and approach to the way of doing business. That actually gave, and people had relationships. So that actually gave us a lot of momentum in terms of creating a new department. The biggest challenge for the new department was, as I said to the member in the last session, we were creating 3 departments from 2, and that meant obviously the core corporate functions, finance, security, HR, were effectively spread between those 3 departments, and we had to rebuild some of the capacity that was needed across. And that took certainly that period from March 2023, February 23, through to, I'd say, summer recess. That was a real build phase for the department. Since summer recess of 23, it feels much more around essentially realising the benefit. No organisation has ever done. You have to constantly adapt to what's going on in the outside world. Obviously an election and a change of government in the middle of all of this. But it feels to me that the department is stable and now adapting and has been able to focus on the new government's priorities through the industrial strategy. It doesn't feel the issues I'm facing at the moment, which are all reflected in the risk register for the 23-24 accounts, are all the classic issues for Whitehall, making sure we have a good employee value proposition. In other words, are we an attractive place to work? Have we got the right incentives for bringing people in? Are we creating the right culture? Have we got the right skills and capability, particularly around business expertise? And have we got the right tech capability? And some of those are the issues we're focused on as we go into the spending review.
Success in the department look like? How do you measure success?
So quite simply, this is a department, its clear priority is economic growth. I mean, you don't need me to sort of go on and say why that's important. We know the poor performance of the UK economy. I mean, so I'd say that since the financial crisis, frankly.
But that is your key priority.
So that's the overall, if you like, that's what I call the North Star, and that's what teams should test themselves against. You've got to make that more operational within that, because that's too abstract, and sometimes some of the lags between the actions that teams will take and economic growth are too long and uncertain. So we break it into three parts. First part is around how we get a strong domestic business environment. What are we doing on competition policy? How are we sorting out regulation? What does that mean for product safety, consumer support? And we have metrics under all of those. But essentially, what is this how is a UK position as a great place to do business and set up a company and flourish with the right consumer protections and worker protections? The second pillar, the second objective, is around how can you make sure the UK is a good place to do business from? And that's the outward focus, because whilst we're still the 6th largest economy in the world, you're never going to have truly global businesses able to be based here and only serve the UK market. It's just not big enough. So you've got to make sure that we have the right connections, be that into the European Union, be that into the States, Middle East, CPTPP. So it's about free trade deals, it's about market access barriers, it's around making sure, and this is particularly challenging obviously at the moment, the global trading environment is supportive of businesses wanting to use the UK as a base. Then the third pillar of our objectives is much more operational pillar, because often when we look at the business department in the past, I think it's too often described itself as a policy department, one that's good at analysis, and there's actually a lot of doing in this department. And for example, we provide there's key services we provide directly to businesses. Investment promotion through the Office for Investment, and you saw that through the International Investment Summit last year. Export promotion work through the Export Support Service, support for small business. what we're doing on export controls, which is a growing part of our work. Previously, we talked about the British Business Bank, Companies House Insolvency Service. These are direct services that are provided to the business where we have key metrics under each one to make sure we're delivering.
If growth is your overriding, which it should be, your overriding priority, how do you measure success in your department as a government whole, for example, with the Treasury and with all the other government departments that you interact with?
My cascade is, I say growth as measured by GDP per head and real household disposable income. They're the ultimate metrics that this government says it wants to be assessed against. You then break that down, all components around the businesses. So within that, what we look at is jobs, wages, exports, investment, and particularly now that we have an industrial strategy within those 8 sectors. Then we have a bunch of what I would more input targets, which will be things like about response times, number of businesses we have directly supported, which are indicators about which give you more real-time data, which then in due course should lead to the outputs we're expecting to deliver. That's what I think. That is what is difficult in the government context. Is the map between the inputs, outputs, and outcomes can often long and variable lags, and so you have to have proxy measures to be able to ensure you're effectively spending your money in the right places and you're holding your teams to account.
I'm sure we will want to unpick some of that as we go through. I've omitted to allow time for 2 top-of-the-session questions, which I think you've been warned about. So I'm going to go first to my very able deputy, Clyde Betts.
There's quite a lot of talk around the steel industry and its future, which I'm sure you've been having a few sleepless nights about over the last few days. So in terms of having a strategy for steel, which is clearly a key industry, can you have a successful steel industry if you can't produce steel from raw materials?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important question, and particularly in a world of increased geopolitical tension, you need to think through exactly what you need to essentially make versus buy. I think all industrialised countries have some form of domestic steel production. But even when there are blast furnaces, obviously we're still then reliant on the inputs to those. So complete domestic UK sovereign capability there's always going to be a dependency externally. We're looking to publish the steel strategy later this spring, which will set out our overall approach to that. That's already been informed by what we are doing with Tata in Port Talbot and obviously the ongoing commercial negotiations.
Right, so you just mentioned the vulnerability of the economy potentially to external forces. So is steel seen then not merely as a good thing in itself, producing in this country, creating jobs and growth, but actually it's really important for our energy security going forwards, because it contributes so much to energy industries, and also for our defence security as well.
Yeah, so I think as we've said in the industrial strategy, we see steel as an absolutely critical foundational sector for the UK, and obviously there's different types of steel, be it longs or flats, in Port Talbot or in Scunthorpe. On defence, you've got Sheffield Forge Masters, which I think really is a I don't need to tell you.
My constituency.
Exactly, that's what I said. I don't need to tell you. It is a pretty, that is a, we use the word unique capability too often, I think, in industrial policy, but that truly is, and the history on that and the criticality of that company to defence. So, yes, of course, I think, as I say, we can't find a single industrialised nation that doesn't have sovereign steel capability. Now, the question, of course, is whether that needs to be blast furnaces or electric arc furnaces. And I bring David in on that, who is our steel expert. But we are working our way through on that. But the critical thing is you can build resilience not necessarily just by having it total through sovereign capability, but by having the right set of imports as well around either the raw materials or the renewable steel.
Yes, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough today. Yes, essentially there was a manifesto commitment in the Labour Party manifesto before the election that the government would be investing £2.5 billion into the steel industry on top of the up to £500 million that we granted to Tata Steel in South Wales. The question for that, and we did a consultation from the middle of February to end of March, was basically to establish what is that steel industry to look like in the UK. And to help us with that, we beefed up the Steel Sector Council, which has got, it's obviously got the steel companies in it, it's led by the Secretary of State, it's got union members on it, and it's got supply chain and R&D expertise. And the answer, what we are hoping to get from the steel strategy, having gone through the consultation with the industry, is essentially to work out what is that future for the UK steel industry, what's it going to look like, do we need to have virgin steel, can we use DRI, what level, and you're absolutely right, of course we depend either on the coke or the iron ore or both coming into this country, at what stage in that supply chain, given that the government is committed to a strong steel industry, are we prepared to actually rely on external providers?
That'll be in the strategy when it comes out.
And that will be in the strategy.
Yes.
It'll all be there.
And we're not going to get any further answers today, I gather, because that's a political decision. That's the
political decision.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Clive. And I have got a topical question, and it's to do with tariffs and the government's easements on electric cars and the effect of steel on the automotive industry. Where are we with the automotive industry? We've seen Jaguar Land Rover suspend their exports to the United States. What is your sort of take on the whole thing?
Yeah, well, obviously it's a very worrying situation in global trade more generally, but particularly on auto in particular, given the 25%. And that's 25% on top of additional tariffs, which sometimes is not mentioned in the media. So it's just to bring out the sort of scale of the intervention here. I mean, JLR, as you say, is I think 75% of its exports go to the US. Then some of the luxury brands, McLaren, Aston, of course, are similarly exposed as well to US trade. I think there's two issues we're working very closely with the industry on. One is to understand the direct impact. I mean, a big question, frankly, is sort of, if you like, the price elasticity. Will, if you're buying a luxury car, the extent to which you'll be affected by the additional price premium or not. It's hard to work out, but we are working through with embassies intel from the dealership networks across the US to understand that. Speaking to JLR, the focus there is on something everyone is really trying to take stock, because of course you've had the initial announcement, but in any trade deals or and tariff situations, the devil really is in the detail, things around rules of origin, the product codes and the like. So at the moment, companies I'm speaking to are very much working their way through what are the implications for this, understanding what that means for both supply chains and customers. What we are conscious of, obviously, this is a headwind for the auto sector, which is absolutely vital for the UK, as we know, especially on the net journey transition. So the government, I think, sorry, I've been in here, so I don't know whether it has been announced, will be announced, but I know the Department of Transport will be bringing forward announcements on the ZEV mandate, exactly. Not changing the overall trajectory or the goal for moving to zero-emission vehicles by 2030, but some of the details of how that is implemented. So, for example, the size of the fines, the ability to trade between different years, the exact ability for hybrids to be counted or not, and so some of easements within that. So trying to keep the balance of the strategic intent with flexibilities, recognising some of the headwinds facing the industry. I think, as you heard from my Secretary of State in the Chamber last week, the focus is to take this calmly. There's always a risk with some announcements of this sort of scale and the sort of movements we're seeing in the market. Plus social media means there's a natural sort of instinct to sort of react in the moment. Essentially, whilst we are very focused on this, but we don't want to overreact. We're working closely with industry, and the Secretary of State, my teams have been speaking with businesses in all sectors since the announcement from the President to understand exactly what the implications for them are. As I say, most businesses, the vast majority of businesses I speak to at the moment are concerned about the scale of the impact, working their way through what the practical implications this will be. Obviously, concern growing as well about the broader financial movements in the markets and what that means, and the potential secondary implications. Because if you look at, say, the OBR forecasts that were published at the time of the spring statement, there's a potential direct impact on the UK. And I think most people were surprised on the upside about the level of the tariff compared to, say, the EU. But there's also the secondary impact, be it through supply chains, lower demand in the economy. So I think the main point I'd like to lead the committee is just how seriously we're taking this and the amount of focus in the department. This is the primary focus of our work at the moment.
Understand that. what are your embassies looking at and talking to these companies? I understand that those inventories, say Jaguar and Land Rover, the number of vehicles already in the States wouldn't be covered by the tariff. Do you have any sort of any overall, not just the car industries, but the overall effect, the immediate effect that this tariff increase is likely to have, because British companies have got significant inventories in the United States, or maybe they haven't? Do you have any feel for that?
I mean, inventories tend to be I don't have
short
numbers in
term,
front of me, but they tend to be short. They, obviously, because it's a big working capital requirement, we've got big inventories, and what we know about the auto sector is it's a tough business to be in, and they're very good at managing their working capital. So, from memory, and I won't remember the dates, but I remember goods in transit. So, in other words, if you got some cars on ships, they won't be caught by tariffs, and there's a cut-off date for that. Similarly, goods that are in the country at the moment. So, what I don't think we're expecting to see, but to be tested, I mean, the uncertainty. But I tell you, this is my judgment at the moment. Is there's not an acute crisis right now. What this is much likely to be is sort of a chronic issue that we need to monitor closely with the sector.
Leave that for now, but that's obviously a very serious issue. So let's move to Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about the department being a front door for business. You gave a really good illustration earlier of a previous regime where a business would go to one department and then walk up the road to speak to another department. But my question relates to that, really, because apart from 5 industry sectors, government support for most sectors still remains with other government departments with DVT involvement. And the NAO report, and I'm going to quote from it, does say that the industry stakeholders they spoke to said they would prefer a single front door for support, and that the Department for Business and Trade would be well placed to do that. What are you doing to ensure that is the case? What should you be doing to ensure that you are an effective front door when you still have to go to 2 different departments in effect?
I think this is a really good question, and I mean, it's hard, as I was saying earlier, it's almost hard to think of a department that doesn't have some work to do with business. Obviously, either that'll be sponsoring a sector like Department for Culture, Media, Sport, obviously responsible for the creative industry sector. DEFRA, though, obviously environmental regulation touches on pretty much all sectors. MOD, obviously, every department has a business interface in some way, shape or form. What I've tried to do here is say, with the creation of DBT, is be really clear. We're the department for all business. So it's not that we do some sectors, we cover the waterfront. What we have then agreed across government is a segmentation of businesses, because there's different ways you can divide up the economy, but effectively we've agreed a 10-segment approach to businesses. So things like advanced manufacturing, creative, life sciences, tech, financial services, I won't remember all 10 now, professional services and the like. Clear on which department is in the box seat. Financial services, obviously, Treasury. But what we say is, for businesses that actually don't have an existing relationship in another department or aren't quite sure where an issue lands, they can come to the Department for Business. They won't just be passed off, but there's a team there that will support them and make that link. Because I think too often in government, all large organisations are complex and there's always wiring, but too often we've shown the wiring in public rather than essentially help manage those relationships. So what we now have under Jaee is a single team that covers all businesses, sometimes to a high degree of depth where it's our responsibility. For ones like creative, which is a responsibility for DCMS, it'll be a smaller team. They're focused on export and inward investment, but we'll also make sure if someone wants to talk to us, we can help them resolve their issues.
That's helpful, thank you. One aspect of the NAO report does refer to duplication of communication or contradictory communication when there's 2 departments involved. And I'd love to know what you're doing to address that, because from the business's point of view, they just want a single point of contact and clarity. So what are you doing to improve on that? Because there's so many government departments, it can't be perfect everywhere.
No.
How are you working on that to make sure that as a business owner, you're getting the clarity and the consistency that you need?
So a couple of things on that. I think what's worked in government. I think the creation of the Office for Life Science has been incredibly effective. And what that was who should AstraZeneca or GSK go to? They need to go to the Department for Health, because obviously drug pricing, a major issue, use of technologies, data and the like. They also needed to go to, in the past, the Business and Science Department, because of course spending on research, connections to universities were absolutely critical. They quite rightly complained about hang on and getting pillar to post. So I think it was in the early 2010s we created the Office for Life Sciences, joint team between the then Business Department and Department for Health. Small team, I think at the time around about 30 people, who would then be they would be the owners of that sector, the voice of the pharmaceuticals, life science industry within government, and a way of integrating the different issues and views and providing a single conduit back out to business. Personally, I would like to build on that because I think that's been an incredibly effective model. What we do in practice essentially is to make sure that my team, so for example, the team working on creative industries, is working hand in glove at working levels with DCMS. Could we go further? I think that's a really good challenge, and I think the NAA report was very good at identifying that.
So is that the model you just described? Is that what you would like to see for every sector?
I think there's certainly potential for that. Obviously, ultimately, these are for ministers to decide, but I think that that single front door for business is certainly something we should be aspiring to.
What's stopping you from doing that now?
I think partly just that this is advice that would need to go to ministers, and it's certainly something you'd want to look at through the spending review.
And what do you think businesses want from the department? What do you think they need, and are you set up to give them that?
I think there's a couple of things that they need, but I would be you're at the sharp end, if you like, so it'd be good to get a sort of sense of what you're hearing. I think they want to have someone who understands what the industry dynamics are. So it's not someone just coming fresh to it and thinking, they've got a depth of experience and expertise. They want someone who, frankly, is a credible interlocutor. In other words, is not just a post box and saying, okay, I'll take the issues off and they'll have a perspective. They're able to give proper advice about where ministers are on policy issues. So it's not always about giving industry what they want. Maybe actually giving someone welcome messages, but at least full and frank. And then being able to guide the industry and help them, not just by passing them off, but making sure they have the right introductions to the relevant teams in different departments. So, for example, I'd expect on automotive, for the teams there to be able to say, look, if you want to really understand how you can work with the university sector, here's the person, I'll arrange a meeting for you with the person responsibility for science policy. Or if you're worried about level 7 apprenticeships, here's a Director General who is leading the work in the Department for Education, and we can sit down and work our way through it. Sometimes business engagement can be seen as just being nice to business. I don't think it is just being nice to business. It's about having full and frank conversations so we can align on the shared agenda, because in my experience, and looking both in Whitehall, but also looking at the history on industrial policy, it's about that sort of awful phrase of co-creation, but working with businesses to an agreed sense of how the industry is going to flourish in the UK. And I think that was reflected in the NAO report, but I don't know if colleagues want to. Yeah,
I mean, I would agree with everything the Permsec has said, but actually, I think there's also the issue of follow through. What businesses want is to be able to speak to somebody in government and know that something is happening as a consequence of that conversation, and it's not just gone into a black hole. And that is something that we're endeavouring to really step up on. There is an issue, there has been an issue also with the fact that businesses end up having conversations, as you've said and the NAO has said, with various different departments, and they also therefore want some sort of clarity and consistency of the message that they're getting back. That's not always going to be possible, because there will be policies that are in flight, in development, where, government, we in Whitehall are still working through which one, if you like, is going to take primacy, or where the sort of policy solution is going to land. And so sometimes it's inevitable that businesses might hear slightly differing views from different government departments. But we certainly want to try and minimise that insofar as possible. And one way of doing that is by ensuring that colleagues across government know about the conversations that have been happening with business by different interlocutors in government. And one of the things that we haven't done and the NAO has talked about is that we have business intelligence products, etc., which we haven't previously shared very well across Whitehall. We are have started to do that in a much more comprehensive way. And in a much more consistent way. So we have now business intelligence that's being shared with 2,500 colleagues across government, including ministers and 16 permanent secretaries. And that is business intelligence which also gives them insight about some of the senior level conversations that have been happening with individual businesses, as well as some of the issues at a sectoral level.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a very simple question, Jaee? Yeah. We will be coming back to the issue of data and sharing information across government, but I gather one of the impediments at the moment is legal impediments about what data you're able to share between departments. That does seem to me a relatively easy problem to resolve. As long as you're not giving out personal data or giving out aggregated data, it surely would be possible to actually, where it's in the interest of business, that you do share data across government, that problem could be resolved.
Yes, and we are sharing aggregated data with key people in government now.
Right.
Biggest challenge, to be frank, is frankly it's a bit like when I was in PwC, is how we shared information with our clients, and you have to create the right incentives. There's obviously some of the technicalities, the legal, the tech platform, but in my experience, that's the easy stuff to get right. The trickier stuff is to make sure it's in people's interests and feel that if I've had a meeting with AstraZeneca, there's a reason for me then to share that with other colleagues, and it's by creating the right community, creating the right incentives, training, I think improving our training on that one. We recently held training right the way across government for everyone involved in business engagement and account management. We brought in our lead non-exec, Paul Drexler, who you'll remember from CBI, so someone who's been like a customer of this, and just set expectations about what good looks like. It's a bit like, the parallel, I think, David, actually, this was your parallel that you mentioned to me a long time ago. The parallel a bit is like our embassies. For our largest companies, you need to have essentially, when I go to the States, I'll always check in with the embassy and the ambassador, especially the ambassador now, to make sure I understand what's going on, the sort of the political context. If you're going off to speak to Barclays, HSBC, we need to have the equivalent there, and you think, actually, it's in my interest to go and check in with the account owner, and also my interest to therefore share information back. And I think we just need to be more disciplined across Whitehall on that. I think that's getting those incentives right, which what we now have is a support through from Downing Street, but also through permanent secretary colleagues as well on this.
Interesting you mentioned the banks. After the ambassador, the banks probably know more about business in a country than anybody else.
Exactly. I think the people I find particularly helpful in terms of giving it real-time intel, not just about their own sector, but across our banks. And say someone like, Sir Mark Tucker is absolutely, it's breadth of perspective, not just about the UK, but globally. But also the advisory firms. So the heads of the advisory firms are obviously have a great reach right the way across the country through their local offices. And I find that sort of real-time information absolutely invaluable.
Very interesting. Only Maynard.
Thank you, Chair. So my written question was to ask you to give a view on department's capability and capacity to support businesses across a variety of sectors, which I think you've probably done quite a lot of, but feel free to add on that. So I was going to add another question, which is around regulation. And DBT has got responsibility for various regulators. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. We're responsible for over 19 partner bodies. They do range from Companies House, FRC, through to the Small Business Commissioner and the Public Code Adjudicator. So you've got quite a range of different bodies, but within that, a large number of regulators. We've got two responses. Sorry, I'm just coming on. I'll come back onto your broader point, but two issues on regulators. One is the ones that are directly under our control. The second issue, we have responsibility across government for regulation policy. And you'll have seen that we've been working closely with Sean and his colleagues on the approach to regulation that was announced by the Prime Minister recently. I think this regulation is obviously not in the right place. I don't think anyone is happy with the sort of regulatory environment in the UK at the moment. There's lots of reasons for that. Partly that was because over the period of Brexit, a lot of powers needed to be repatriated from Brussels. and the speed at which we needed to work meant essentially they were given directly into regulators. So in my previous job, I was in the Department for Transport. We transferred a lot of powers from EASA into the CAA on aviation security. That was a sensible place to put them because of the expertise, but what we didn't have is we needed time then to reflect on exactly which ones were the independent regulatory responsibility of that organisation, like safety. Other things like drones were something more for ministerial control, and getting that balance between what's under ministerial control versus what's operationally independent is important. I think, and this has been a case on regulation right the way across the Western world, the growth of regulation. I think City UK have done some very interesting work on the increased costs of financial services regulation, both the number of employees who are in regulators, the cost of that. I think estimates from James Palmer put it in the sort of the low single-digit billions. Sometimes the debate on regulation can, I think, unfairly get sort of put into either bonfire of red tape or we must protect consumers, and it becomes a bit of a false dichotomy. For me, it's about, when I hear from businesses, the concern I have is sometimes about the nature of the regulation, but much more about how the regulators operate. So what some businesses say for me, and for example, this is feedback we've had on the Competition and Markets Authority, totally recognise that we need to have strong competition rules because we know that's what drives a successful economy, protects new entrants, but it's the pace at which decisions are made. I think this is where the chief executive has it exactly right with her 4 Ps. Some of the cases took over 22 months to adjudicate on a hostile takeover. And as you'll know, that's just not the pace at which businesses' decisions are made. And so often a quick no is what businesses are looking for, rather than a long drawn-out process. And so what we're looking to do for our work on regulation, hand in glove with Treasury on this, is make sure we can upgrade the capability of regulators. And I think that's a number of things. It's about the leadership, and we've made some changes recently. It's about, say, capability in ensuring that we can have the right level of pay flexibilities to attract the right people. Big challenge for the Competition and Markets Authority is the civil service pay constraints, which we know we need to look at, but you can see the difference, say, in Ofcom, where they have more flexibility because they're industry funded. Then also duties. I think the multiplication of duties causes ambiguity for businesses and regulatory ambiguity, which is not always helpful. So if you look at Ofwat, and I know that Ofwat is currently under review from DEFRA, I think from Dan Curry and others, they have over 21 duties on the regulator, and I think when you have 21 duties, it's almost like you have no duties. And whether we can simplify that and bring that to a clearer system so it's much more clearer and able to understand. And I think what we have tried to do over the recent months is simplify some of those structures. I think if I point to things that I think of as success, in the FRC, the appointment of Jan du Plessis, Richard as chief exec, has made a big difference in the feedback we've got on the way in which the FRC is operating. That feels like a step change. CMA feels like a very different organisation now with Doug Gurr and the focus of the chief exec on on pace and simplicity of work. Also looking through the way in which we do duties and economic regulation more generally.
Right, Bets.
Just following one question, the answer you gave there, Permanent Secretary. This issue about civil service pay.
Mm-hmm.
It comes up so many times in our hearings, whether it be IT specialists or construction specialists, where the private sector is clearly a competitor with needing exactly the same skills. Why don't departments just get on and deal with it?
Well, I feel asking a civil servant whether they'd like a pay rise is sort of one of the easier questions. But no, seriously,
I wasn't offering you all a pay rise. I was saying that where you need to attract someone in particular, you have to pay them. Why should a framework get in the way of it?
No, I think there's always a difficult and delicate balancing act to do on this one, because obviously we've got to make sure we're value for money for taxpayers. That's absolutely critical. So I think, I don't think I can think of a civil service outside of, say, Singapore, which offers top decile pay or anything approaching that. But of course it's got to be competitive. There's lots of advantages to working in the public sector. I made the move across from the private sector, and the impact you can have, the breadth of experience, the complexity of the issues, the sort of purpose you get from the work, we shouldn't underestimate that. And I often find for people at different stages of their career, sometimes they'll have worked in the private sector, then come in and do a period of, if you like, public service, and we can tap into that. So having flexibility of how we attract people, how we do design jobs is right. But for some, I think for some roles which are very comparable to those in the private sector, I think some of the finance roles, the program management specialists, digital, that is harder to attract sometimes. Sometimes on digital, actually, the complexity of the challenge, government digital services were very successful on pitching to people sense of purpose. And I think the Cabinet Office has successfully brought in some pay flexibilities around the way in which some of the commercial structures operate. It's always I do hesitate because I know this is a difficult balance around.
They ask for your input into that.
Sorry? They do, yeah. And, I'm very conscious of both, but the sort of, my budget, how I have flexibilities. What you don't want to have is departments competing against each other. I mean, one of the slightly unusual things I find in Whitehall is each government department is its own employer rather than the civil service as a whole, which means you have to coordinate between. But the way in which the Cabinet Office works through the Permanent Secretary there is we input in terms of where we see difficulties and shortages in recruitment. Tech is the obvious one. We have an ambition to increase the number of our digital staff in the department. I certainly would like to grow our digital function over the spending review, even as our overall headcount is likely to reduce. Making sure we can be competitive within the bounds of, frankly, public acceptability as well as value for money for the taxpayer is critical on this.
Back to the department now that was created. Have you just carried on with the allocation of staff to deal with different industries and their needs? Have you actually done an overall look at where your priorities should be and then move staff around to fit that?
I'll bring David in who led this work, but the key thing we did when we created the department, we had essentially two sets of sectors teams. In the old Department for International Trade, we had sector teams who were focused on export promotion, inward investment advice. We had those teams. In the old business department, we had teams focused on the domestic issues, focused particularly on advanced manufacturing, steel and the like. So we brought those two sets of teams together and then restructured them around, I think I mentioned earlier, the sort of the 10 sectors of the economy. And the calculation we made on sort of where we'd put our resource was essentially on two questions. One was on, frankly, the scale of those sectors, how important they are as a share of GVA, but also where government can make a difference. Because in some sectors, actually, there is limited scope for government intervention other than the broader business environment. Sectors like steel, there's a closer working relationship with the government than the share of GVA might suggest. But David, I don't know if you want to sort of take through how you approach this.
Yes, so the machinery of government change happened in February 2023, and in that first phase that Gareth was talking about of the integration, the merger, we put together the sector teams, the ones who are dealing from former DIT, mostly with exports and investment, and the teams from former Bays who were dealing mostly with the policy and engagement with the sectors. I think what we were trying to do was to make sure that we had, from the team's perspective, that they had a common goal. And
the previous statement.
You're right. What we wanted to make sure is that they had a common goal. And so what we started focusing on was, rather than perhaps more the input side, which was a lot more of what we were doing on the exports and investment side, we were trying to work out what was the desired outcome. And of course, the desired outcome, whatever the colour of the government at that stage, was economic growth. And so what we did was we established so-called sector views, where we took the business intelligence, business engagement and analysis to work out which were the particular drivers that would drive growth in that sector the most. And remember, at that time, there was no industrial strategy deliberately. What we then did was we basically said, well, okay, in order to deliver that, given that a lot of the levers that sit behind that growth sit in other government departments, DCMS with creative, DESNES for clean energy, what we need to do is we need to make sure that they share our view and we share their view on what is it that will bring growth into that sector. We then needed to make sure, coming back to the point about how do you make sure people don't trip over each other, we started trying to stand up what we called handshakes, which were basically agreeing what it was that each department was going to do, whose responsibility was which, and then we came up with so-called sector action plans. The idea being that you had an agreed, resourced, shared plan with those other government departments about how you were going to deliver. What that essentially meant is that we looked through all of the 10 sector categories that we had, and we basically looked at, do we own the policy on that sector? Is that sector in a period of significant transition, like the automobile industry or the aerospace industry? Or what's our level of responsibility? And is there public money involved? What level of assurance? What level of program delivery do we need to put around that? And then what we did is we sized the teams in order to meet those needs and to match the obligations that we were taking on under these sector action plans. And the NAO report very fairly says, all the directorates are about the same size, which is absolutely true. That was because we were trying to make sure that the directors had essentially the same team sizes to manage. But actually the teams within the specific sector teams were very different, varying from sort of 35 in terms of advanced manufacturing, which would probably be the biggest because we've got big programs in there, the ATF, the APC, to I think some of the smaller teams were around creative. Now that was if you like, a sort of first step towards where we've got to today, and I don't know whether Jaee wants to come into how we've done that more.
Yes, so I'm continuing to review the structure since I started in January, and that is because the sort of changes that were made last year were made in advance of the new government, in advance of the industrial strategy, and I'm quite clear that although it's taken us part of the way there, it's not taken us all of the way there. So I'm currently reviewing and trying to clarify our boundaries and priorities in relation to other parts of DBT as well as other government departments. I'm also quite clear that we have to allocate resources to the top priority sectors and have fewer resources in those which are not the top priority sectors. And we also want to be as efficient and effective to business as we discussed earlier. So I am still reviewing all of that and making changes.
But it's still very much, it seems to be a bit this approach where you've got each sector being looked at specifically and a bit in isolation. There doesn't seem to be an overarching approach. Just for example, on issues like skills or regulation, which we've talked about, they're cross economy issues, not ones that can be looked at in each individual sector. So how do you marry together teams with each sectors with the need to have overall approaches?
Right, and to be honest, I'd add another dimension to that complexity, one of geography, because you need to think about both what's going on in individual sectors. You need to think about the sort of, as you say, the cross-economy questions, but then also what's happening in different geographies. That could be within the UK, what's happening in the northwest, across the world as well. So that's within the department. We have teams that cover those sort of three functions, and the trick is how you then bring those perspectives together. The way in which we integrate from bottom up the sector view is around the industrial strategy. So I've got a team that runs the industrial strategy, working hand in glove with the Treasury on the wider growth mission. What their job is to do is to understand for those growth sectors what's needed within those growth sectors to ensure they can flourish over the next decade. But then also have that perspective of what business is asking for as a whole from the business environment. So in other words, what changes they want in the regulatory environment, as we were talking about in terms of sort of speed of decision making, how the competition environment needs to adapt for the greater focus on digital competition, employment rights and the changes through Make Work Pay. So you've got that integration. Similarly, there'll be different issues in different parts of the country. Working with Greater Manchester, for example, yes, there'll be some issues that are common to all businesses that are common in Greater Manchester, but we know specifically there's questions around skills, transport connectivity and the like. So you've got to bring those three dimensions together to get a proper informed position.
I don't mind, Permanent Secretary, whether you or David or Jaee answers this question, but if you look at figures 6 and 7 in the NA report, and looking at the amount you spend on those various sectors, and then looking at figure 7, the amount of people that are actually employed in those sectors. So if you took, for example, advanced manufacturing, on which you spend, well, for some reason it's not in. No, well, let's take a different example. Automotive, for example, you spend 175 million. You've got. There must be something wrong with these figures somehow. One person involved. Advanced.
Where are we?
On figure 7.
That's all money, not people.
The figures in brackets, I think, are people, aren't they?
Seven.
Sizes. Oh, sorry, I was on 6. Sorry.
Advanced manufacturing, for example, you spend 250 million on, and you've got 38 people doing it. Financial and professional services, you spend 2 million on, you've got 25 people looking at it. So it doesn't look as though the amounts that you're spending actually correlate with the amount of people you're employing in these 10 priority groups.
Right.
Far from it.
Exactly. They'll be very different.
And is that a reason for that?
Yes. I think let's stand back in terms of what we're trying to do and what our role is with these sectors. It's not just about paying out money to sectors, would be my main thing. Our role here is to work with sectors to understand how best government can work with them so they flourish over the next decade. Let me use an example of financial services. It's led by Treasury. Government has worked hand in glove with the financial services sector over, frankly, decades to ensure that the UK has a real international advantage in those sectors. It's not about giving them money. But, the last thing the banks need is money from us. What it is about ensuring, say, regulation is appropriate. When we're a part of the European Union, ministers would go to Brussels to make sure that we're reflecting, yes, the bank's interests in some of the debates around, say, clearing and the like. It might be around skills and access to business mobility. For banks in particular, it was around the redevelopment of Canary Wharf and the Jubilee Line extension in the late 90s. That wasn't around a grant programme that has been run out. So the way in which we'd work with that sector is very different to, say, what we would be doing with the automotive sector, which is a much more what you might call traditional industrial policy intervention, where you run something like the Automotive Transformation Fund, where you bid in for R&D funds.
Is the department agile on this? If we suddenly get a problem like we've got with the automotive industry at the moment, back to the previous question on tariffs, would you suddenly be able to bring more people in if there was a need to really do something dramatic in a particular sector?
So again, I might come to Jaee in a minute, but look, the whole point around the way in which the business group is structured is to try and be able to do two things. One is to have, we were saying about what businesses want. They want some depth of expertise. So they don't want to speak to someone who's like, it's the first time they've dealt with a car company. But you need to have some flexibility as well and trying to have that mix of skills so you do surge. For example, on steel, at one point there were only 3 people working the steel team. 2 months later, this was back in 2016, we surged that when I was responsible for that, up to 120. So you're able to flex that, but I don't know, Jaee, if you want to talk about some of the flexibility issues.
We have been, I have been flexing resources from one team into another. For example, I have recently added 4 people from one team into the auto team. And that's something I would expect to do on an ongoing basis. To be able to flex resources across your group as priorities shift is normal and essential. But my group also has in it a team which is specifically about response to events and shocks, and that is a really critical resource that we have, because it is in essence a small pool of people who can be flexed to really major priorities and who will also help to manage that priority with some really sensible governance structures, rules and modes of working. A really simple example would be you need a standard copy list. For example, if you are managing a crisis, you need somebody who's logging all the commissions to ensure that they're being delivered to the right time, to the right deadline, etc. So it's that sort of very simple program management, project management discipline that they also bring to any sort of major shock or situation.
Thank you very much for that, Jaee. Thank you. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Bickerton, can you say why is it so difficult for you to produce an overview of all the support programmes that the department offers? This is referring to where in the report, paragraph 10, that the department doesn't routinely break down what its current support offering looks like, and so you don't have that comprehensive understanding of how resources are spent between different types of support. So there's programme spending, grant expenditure, and business group resource spending, but not support type.
I think there's two bits to that, which is I think the first thing is when we are looking at a support proposal, we start off with what's the policy objective that we're trying to get at, and that's what's the outcome that ministers want to achieve. And of course, what that means is that what we will then do is we will say, okay, what's the support what is the outcome we want? Do we want to have factories making this product? Do we want to have services providing that service? Then we look at, is there a market failure? What is that market failure? And then we try to look at the means of supporting that outcome to arrive. Mm-hmm. And then finally what we do is we then look at the how can we drive out the most benefit for the cost that is associated with that. So in a way, what's interesting listening to the conversation over the past few minutes is we're talking about matrices, and three, I think I got lost at three, but essentially you've got sectors, you've got levers, you've got geography, you've got all these different things, and what you're trying to do is identify, you could put in that, what is the nature of the support. I think actually the way that we look at it at the moment is helpful in that what we look at is what is the policy outcome that we do, and then how do we drive that policy outcome, which tools do we use. And does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It does. But to the NAO's observation on this, how are you able to make decisions about what the right kind of support and level of support is to the different sectors if you don't know what support you're currently offering?
Would it be helpful to go through what we do with a particular proposal at any stage? Would that be useful to bring that to life a bit? So basically what happens is the policy team will sit there and will work out what's the market failure, what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and they will come to a view on the back of their understanding of what is the best lever or tool that we have to achieve that. And of course, what they will be looking at is the fact that most of the time the companies that we're engaging with are internationally mobile. Whether Tata chooses to invest its money in the UK or in Germany or in Holland is going to depend on the return that they're going to get on that. So we're constrained also in that way. What we then do, once we've established what we think is the best type of intervention, is we put it through our internal processes. For transactions where we're committing up to £20 million, we have a grant delivery group, a grant delivery team, who are mostly looking at how the portfolio of that looks like, because £20 million is obviously a lot of money, but we obviously have lots of engagements of under £20 million. For ones over £20 million, what we will have is we have the investment committee which meets, and it's met, I think, 10 times in the past 16 months. What it will be doing is constantly looking at, and we use the Treasury five-tier principles. So we look at value for money, we look at commercial, we look at, I will remember them all in due course, economics, strategic. And what we do is we have some very experienced and very helpful people who've got better memories than me, luckily. And what they will do is we have a key holder for each of those. The key holders will look at each intervention that we're looking to make through each of those 5 key holders, if you like. And then they will challenge the SRO who's bringing the proposal to the investment committee to ensure that not just they're making, they're achieving best value for money, but they're getting good commercial deals, that they're making sure that the AO advice is strong. So that essentially what you're doing is we have this team who are bringing the experience of the department into every assessment. So, does that make sense?
It does. I think what you're describing is where you've got proposals for how the business can drive its own strategic objectives. So I suppose the question I'm asking is the other way round. Mm-hmm. When businesses are coming to your department for support, and so instead of the drive coming from you, it's coming from them. What are the resources available to them, and how do you know which of those are effective in terms of providing businesses what they're looking for?
1 year ago, that would have
I mean,
company in distress.
I mean, you mean when the company comes to us and they're in distress? So most of the time, I mean, we will...
Not necessarily distressed, they're just looking for support.
So if they, I mean, we would expect to know if they were coming to us to look for support. Half the point of the business engagement, business intelligence, and having that in a very coordinated across the whole of government is incredibly important. So we should know what it is that they would be coming to us for. What we should also know is our assessment shared with the other government departments who share the levers with us in terms of how that sector works. We should understand what our view is of what are the levers that would make the biggest difference. Is it R&D? Is it investment? Is it regulation? What's the category of things that we need? So that by the time a company came to us, whether in distress or actually with an opportunity, we would have an understanding of what we would expect that long before they actually came and asked us for any money or other intervention, that we would have formulated a view about how we might help them best.
Shall I bring that to life? I mean, let's just make it sort of tangible. A classic example would be an automotive company. What they'll do is say, we're looking to do a new line for a new model. We're considering a range of different sites, Czech Republic, Spain, UK. We would then work with them through our Office for Investment to say, okay, well, how can we make the UK the most attractive place? And often what we are is we're on the same side as a UK team, because the way these corporates typically structure those deals is they'll have competing bids in from their Czech, Spanish and UK teams. So we're part of Team GB to think, okay, well, how can we best land this? Now, one of the challenges which I thought was helpfully brought out by the NAO was, well, okay, how do you know how much support to give? Because you don't want to run after everything. You want to know actually what's important. And I think that's where the industrial strategy comes in, because what the industrial strategy does is give you a framework for saying, this investment is strategically important, or it might be this investment is great to get if we can make the numbers add up on this case, but there's no additionality, there's no benefit beyond the individual investment. And the classic example of what I mean by strategic investment would be Nissan in the 80s. When you think through when Nissan was brought to Sunderland in back end of the 80s, sorry, I'm showing my age here.
I can remember it well.
But I think what was interesting, it wasn't just the direct jobs that were created by the new plant. It had an outsized impact on the region, created a whole supply chain of auto, but it also completely turned around the UK automotive industry, which I think was fair to say was seen as dying at the time. You then had Toyota coming in and had a real revival of the sector. So you can sort of see investments need to be looked at through two lenses. It can just be, does it frankly wash its own face on its own sake, or is it part of a more strategic view about where the UK wants to take the economy? What we've got now with the industrial strategy is an opportunity to set out clearly and explicitly the type of economy we want to be over the next decade, where we see strategic investments are going to be important. So we're not just in responsive mode. And where I really want the Office for Investment to be is basically, yes, being able to respond effectively when companies come to us with an opportunity, but actually say, what are the best companies in the world that we'd like to have in the UK? And to use the Nissan example, who are the Nissan of the 2020s that could turn around an industry, turn around a region in the UK by getting them to come and base themselves here?
Thank you. Ms. Samant, just very quickly, when you're making decisions about support, how are you balancing trade-offs, and how can you make those trade-offs explicit? So, for example, bringing economic benefit to a whole region, as Mr. Davies just said, how are you balancing perhaps pursuing that objective against perhaps a net zero objective?
Yep.
And how are those calibrated within the assessment process?
I mean, I go back to the 5 Treasury tests that David rattled off with some help.
I had 4, but there we are.
And so we do use those, of course, in trying to sort of assess. There is inevitably some subjective judgment applied to this as well. It isn't a straightforward mathematical game. You do think not just about the economics of the proposition in a narrow sense, but you think about, as Gareth said about Nissan, the impact that it will have on jobs, on the community, potentially on supply chains, etc. And ultimately, we will put a proposition to ministers who will make a decision based on, the judgment that we've given them and based on their own understanding of what the trade-off ought to be. So it is a mix of strong data, facts and evidence overlaid by some judgment.
I wonder if it might be worth bringing the Treasury in for the overall growth mission and the missions more broadly.
Yeah, I think a couple of things I'd add. I mean, we'll want to look at the kind of best range of evidence that we have, and if in the case of the example you talk about, we can assess the carbon impacts of doing something, then we'll take that into account in terms of the overall assessment here alongside the kind of economic.
Can I just quickly ask you, do you think it is obvious to stakeholders how you evaluate, say, net zero against economic growth, to take sort of a classic fault line, if you like?
I think it will vary from policy to policy. There'll be some policies where I think it is quite visible and understood that we are, where the net zero impacts are quite significant and we want to weigh those up. In others, they will be more marginal and that will probably be less recognised and known. I think in the case of the industrial strategy itself, we've said that obviously its principal objective is growth, but it also has a set of other objectives that we care about, one of which is net zero, one of which is security and resilience, and one of which is regional impacts. In terms of choosing the sectors that...
You make it transparent how you're going to balance those subsidiary objectives against each other.
I think we've talked a little bit in the Green Paper about how we chose the sectors, which is the initial decision that I think we kind of made with the industrial strategy. I would expect us to say a bit more when we publish the industrial strategy document itself in due course later in the spring about how we've gone about working out what subsectors we want to support. And yes, I think you would expect to say a bit more then about how you're making those trade-offs and what your methodology is.
I think look, to be frank, and building on what Jaee was saying as well, I mean, this is tough, and the risk of, you could try and boil this down to a single number, and to a certain extent that's what the cost-benefit analysis does. It tries to get to a BCR point estimate, as Sean was saying. You value the carbon impact. I worry, though, sometimes you can't just boil things down to that, and it will ultimately rest on a ministerial judgment. We do try and bring that out as much as possible. But when you think back to the member's question around steel, you can look at the sort of the cost benefit per job saved and etc. Things around security, national security and resilience are quite hard to put into a single metric, and so I think ultimately that will be a judgment call around essentially where the steel strategy will come out around, well, actually, what sort of steel industry do you want in this country, which ultimately is appropriate for ministers. So I don't mean to say, therefore, it'll always be ambiguous and there's a bit of a black box, but whilst you can price some things, you can't price everything.
Makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Nevertheless, Sarah, on this question is really important. We've just done a recent hearing on electricity bills, and we discovered that our electricity bills are amongst the highest, if not the highest in the world, principally because we put green levies on them. You then have to mitigate that by having a high electricity users group, but it isn't just the high electricity users group, it puts every other business at a competitive disadvantage to their neighbours who have higher or lower electricity bills. So how do you balance these things?
Yeah, so look, this is through two things. One is issue like electricity prices, obviously that sits across two departments, which makes it more complex, but actually it means it formalises the way in which the agreement needs to happen across Cabinet. This is where the Treasury comes in terms of being able to look at issues in the round. So on issues whereby, let's say DESNES, the Department for Energy, will want to put in levies for, say, hydrogen or whatever it may be, that will then be considered across government. We would then make our representations based on our conversations through with steel, other materials companies, but actually increasingly electricity prices aren't just about old heavy industry, it's also about what might be seen as the newer centres. Data centres, for example, 40% of their cost base is from electricity. We'd then play that in. That would be looked at in the round by the Treasury, and then ultimately be a decision, frankly, for the Cabinet in the right forum. And what you do have now, which I think is different to previous administrations, is through this mission structure. You have a growth mission board, which is chaired by the Chancellor, which is able to look at issues in the round and ultimately, through the Cabinet Office, make trade-offs where, because I'd argue net zero and growth aren't totally in conflict, but they're not always perfectly aligned. But that forum is then able to make these choices and trade-offs.
Thank you. I bet.
Right. We talked before. We talked about the relationship with other departments and the influence you have over them, or don't have over them in some cases. Can I just put one particular example to you, which I've got a special interest in, but we've already mentioned Forge Masters, so we're back onto that territory. We've got a situation where the government spends a lot of money buying Forge Masters, investing substantial sums, £900 million into new forging presses. It's great for defence, we need it. Creates capacity for civil nuclear. We've got DESNZ now making a decision about small modular reactors and which two providers will be. We've got your department giving money to Rolls-Royce, a separate deal. Then Rolls-Royce goes off to the Czech Republic and does a deal there to build small modular reactors with the Czechs. So how does that help to an industrial strategy? Where you're giving money to Rolls-Royce, they're going off to the Czechs. The Department of Defence has invested in new forging presses at Forge Masters, which if the work goes to the Czech Republic, they'll have all that capacity sat there unused. It's a bit incoherent, isn't it?
Right, so there's quite a lot in your question there, but let me sort of unpack that as such. What first is sort of how do we work across Whitehall to effectively align these interests? And because different departments will quite rightly have just different, it's not so much they disagree, it's just different perspectives on issues. You know, defence is naturally focused on ensuring the right supply of material, education focused on skills. We've got to then bring that together. I think there's two things we have now which enable that integration of different perspectives and resolving where departments differ. At political level, at ministerial level, as I mentioned, this Growth Mission Board. Chancellor chaired, bringing together secretaries of state from the relevant economic departments and able to look at issues in the round. You know, in my 20 years in Whitehall, that's not happened before. So that is an important forum for actually trying to resolve that. Underpinning that is something that I set up with my counterpart in the Treasury 2 years ago, which is a Permanent Secretary's Business and Growth Group. So I bring together with James Bowler, the Treasury Permanent Secretary, other Permanent Secretaries to make sure we have an understanding in the round of these issues. And that means that, for example, on issues like net zero or trade, we're able to have a forum where we can, at the minimum, share our different perspectives and ensure, therefore, that our ministers are better informed and they can have better conversations in the round as a single government. There's a specific point you make on Rolls-Royce, and actually is well-timed. Last week, I chaired what we have every 6 months. We meet with Rolls-Royce. I chair the meeting. We bring together the permanent secretaries who are involved with Rolls-Royce because there'll be a range of departments. You mentioned MOD. We had David Williams. We had Jeremy Pocklington, permanent secretary of the Energy Department, Transport, Treasury, and we had a single integrated conversation with Tufan, his top team, about what the government is looking for from Rolls-Royce, what they are looking at, where their commercial position is, where they are focused on to align our objectives, to make sure they didn't feel that they were being pulled in different directions on this. And for some of our most important British companies, like Rolls, or companies like Airbus, which having deep relationships with the UK government, we now have those more integrated single conversations across the system.
Yes. Okay. It's quite a long answer to an even longer question. I agree. That's right. But in the end, we're looking here about whether the objective is growth in British jobs.
Yeah.
So when I challenge and say decisions were made about which technology can be used for SMRs, no one can say, and we will require the companies to produce the SMRs here. Mm-hmm. Doesn't seem. I would have thought that's a given. Yeah, if you were asking for a French civil servant here, they'd say, "Well, of course we're going to produce them in France." There wouldn't be any argument about it. That would be the focus. So I'm just missing that point about the determination to have a clear message for growth, which means jobs, which means actually requiring work to be done in this country.
Look, I think you make a really interesting point around sort of how you approach industrial policy and the extent to which you use the power of government procurement to really drive that policy. I think you can certainly see the intent and focus of this administration on growth and jobs, and that's clearly up front. I mean, Treasury colleagues may want to come in. Of course, the risk, if you then limit a procurement to only people who are active in the UK, is you limit the competitive pressures and you may end up paying more at a lower quality. So that's always a challenge with industrial policy, is making sure that preference for production within the country does not lead into sort of producer capture, poorer quality and high costs. And that's always, you've always got to get that tension right about the level of competition you inject.
I understand the tension, but sometimes that competition can mean, what's the cheapest price we're going to get something for, and ignore all the other knock-ons about supply chains and jobs and an effect that we talked about before on the whole of the economy, not just that narrow bit of procurement.
No, totally. And I think that that's part of the rationale for the changes to the procurement legislation that you've seen, enabling governments, when we do a procurement, to look in a broader set of criteria. Because you're right, and it's probably natural for any sort of procurement function to naturally focus on cost, because there's risk of focusing on a single number. It's hard to get critiqued if you buy the cheapest, whereas the broader characteristics are hard to bring into effect. The new procurement legislation gives you a broader sense of issues that you're able to consider as you're buying this.
All I'd add to what Gareth said is, obviously, part of that assessment is about looking at the costs and benefits as they stand. As Gareth said earlier, and I think this is kind of reflected in the Green Book, we want to look at the wider strategic case around each investment, and the exact right answer to that will vary depending on the investment, but we've deliberately set that up in a way that we aren't just focusing on the kind of single number.
It ties in as well to the skills, doesn't it? I mean, something we've already referred to has been absolutely crucial to the whole of the strategy, and particularly with the Department of Education leaning on that. But again, I'll just use the example because I happen to know about the SMRs. I just don't see anyone so far doing an assessment about the effect on the supply chains, the effect on the skills that are going to be needed to actually build not merely the total product of the SMRs, but the various components in this country. I just don't. I mean, surely, if an announcement about a particular technology is only a few months away, that work should have happened already, and it isn't. Why not?
I mean, I'd have to sort of defer to my colleague from the Department for Education, but that's exactly what Skills England is doing, is identifying. And remember, we're developing the industrial strategy in parallel, so there's a sequencing issue here, but effectively saying these are the industries we want to be strong in over the next 10 years. Therefore, where the skills gap, and where should Skills England be focused, and that's the work that they're doing.
Might I just add,
please,
that also just in developing the industrial strategy, we've actually established a skills forum bringing together the lead departments, and that's meeting weekly, and that's trying very much to do what you have talked about, in effect, to review the progress and to agree next steps on the industrial strategy and what will be needed to underpin delivery of it. And ministers are also meeting. Our Secretary of State met the Education Secretary earlier in March, pretty much to talk about the criticality of skills to the success of the industrial strategy.
Talk to the MOD as part of this as well, because they're often forgotten about, but with the amount of growth that could be happening there.
Exactly. I mean, sure, may want to talk about the growth board, but as I mentioned in that meeting with Rolls-Royce, Airbus, David Williams, Permanent Secretary of MOD, was there as well, and of course we have a joint team with the MOD on it, particularly on defence exports, because given the scale of UK demand, the only way in which you can really have sovereign capability is making sure you're designing for export. You can't just do that for the UK.
Yeah, I'd just add that obviously a really important part of the defence announcement the government's made is how we use that in a way that supports domestic growth, and obviously some announcements were made at the spring statement around that, around issues like domestic procurement and innovation in the UK. We obviously need to now see that through to make sure that when the defence industrial strategy kind of comes out in fully fleshed form, that supports growth in the United Kingdom, and that's a really critical objective.
All the bodies, the UKRI, Innovate UK and Catapult Network, all key bits in this. Are they all on board? Is there a coherence there that comes through you as Permanent Secretary?
Yeah, so UKRI doesn't report to me. It reports to my colleague in the Department for Science, Innovation, Technology. But actually, by chance, I had breakfast with the Chief Executive of UKRI today, and we talked about the actual critical role of UKRI, because we know because I say all successful industrial strategies are based off what a country is good at. Not trying to be someone else, but being clear, have a clear-eyed view about where we're strong, where we can build off those strengths, and align those with the market opportunities. And what we do know is, of course, our strengths in science, technology, innovation, and connecting that, having a stronger connection between what goes on in our universities and what goes on in our businesses. The Catapult networks are part of that. I think they've existed now for the best part of 15 years. I think they're now seeing, particularly the advanced manufacturing catapult, I think has been, you'll know that well. is incredibly effective in terms of how it's been able to anchor research here. But any industrial strategy worth its salt needs to be anchored in our strengths, which is the university sector.
I think Clive Betts has raised a really interesting point, given that Innovate UK, UKRI and the catapults are all based in DCIT. Do you have a really close relationship with them? Because this is where the green shoots are being formed, where the innovation is coming from. The report sort of is quite fuzzy on your relationships with other departments. I'm wondering really whether your relationship with DCIT is absolutely as close as it needs to be. And really with the 15 other government departments that you interact with, we've mentioned a lot with education and skills, why do you not have a specific MOU with every single one of them, so each one of them knows what to expect from you and you know what to expect from them, to get a joined up whole of government thinking?
That's a very good question, whether we should have an MOU. I think the way in which I'd say it feels different now post-election rather than pre is because you've got an industrial strategy. But remember, before we didn't have an explicit single strategy. Now you do. All those departments now know they are feeding in, and part of their responsibilities are through into the industrial strategy, and they're playing their role, and they have an explicit role to feed into that. So at the moment, I don't feel there's any sort of sense of departments not being on the pitch. This all feels very aligned because you have the unifying force of the growth mission. Good question whether an MOU would make a difference. I'll take that away and reflect on it. But I don't feel in practice, given either the sort of the personal relationships I've got or the day-to-day working with the teams, there's any gap between us.
Well, the report does come up with several examples, particularly on page 35, of where the relationships are not as close as they maybe should be. And I think that sort of thing could be solved by an MOU.
I mean, some of the report was done before the industrial strategy structures were created, so I'm not dismissing it, but I just think there has been progress since the report.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Charlie Maynard, please.
Yes, so I'm looking at the NAO report, page 12, para 16, which says DBT's business group is responsible for 32 initiatives to support industry sectors, but is monitoring and evaluation of evidence for just 11 of these. And then it goes on to say, other types of support may be more challenging to monitor and measure. So but the question was, if there's 32 out there and you're measuring 11, what's happening to the other 21? And is there a kind of effective way of working out which ones of these are working well and which ones aren't?
Yeah, so I think there's a materiality question in terms of which ones, because obviously there's a value for money in just who you where you're putting your monitoring and evaluation. So whilst by numbers totally agree, I think in terms of value, I haven't got the figure in front of me, that would skew much more to be a higher proportion of spend value being monitored. However, I think it is fair to say that we need as a department, as a new department, to step up the quality of evaluation. I think that's been far too sporadic and not have the consistency that I would like to see on some of our historic spend. So I want to use the opportunity of the spending review, which we're in the middle of at the moment, to both ensure that we've got, historically we understand what's worked, what's not, but also looking forward that we're embedding the evaluation in from the start. Sometimes these programs are quite hard to evaluate because the counterfactual is very difficult, but obviously there's ways in which you can do that through logic models, through sometimes RCTs, but that's often hard to do. Certainly through some of the data matching we've done in the past, we've been able to understand where projects are effective, but also critically where we've seen them not be effective, making sure we stop the programs. So for example, Help to Grow Digital, we knew the way that was designed was not as effective, and we've stopped that. Other ones we've been able to grow and learn from, like the aerospace and automotive. But I think government as a whole, and my department, I include in that, needs to strengthen the way in which we do monitoring and evaluation.
So sorry, we're carry on.
No, we're good.
You're good. Okay, right. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of when the industrial strategy is introduced, what will be the step change for the department in terms of the support that it's providing?
The main thing the industrial strategy will provide is a single shared view about what we are trying to achieve for the UK economy. I mean, I think one of the challenges that the NAO report presented quite rightly was, how are we making choices between different sectors? Do we have an explicit, and you mentioned, are we as transparent as we could do about where we want to take these sectors over the medium to long term? The industrial strategy will set out that clear vision. Crucially, I think, as well, shared with industry, because I think if you look at the international experience of when industrial policy works and when it doesn't, it's when it's developed in partnership with business. It's not Whitehall doing it to business, it's working in partnership with business. There'll be a shared, explicit strategy. There'll be governance around to make sure, again, what works on industrial policy is consistency. I think where policies have failed in the past is too much chopping and changing, if I can put it politely. So having a shared industry board, that's worked well actually in automotive. You've had the Auto Council now since 2011. Big primes, some of the supply chain members, shared jointly with government. That has given a consistency of approach, which I think has come through in terms of some of the investments we've seen. So you'll have that governance and structure. You'll also have, and I think this is what I'm particularly excited about, is external challenge through the Industrial Strategy Council, chaired by Claire Barkley. And the idea there is, because what we have heard from businesses repeatedly is this sense of the government, chopping and changing policy. And if you're making an investment, that's a multi-year, typically multi-billion investment for a company. They need to know they have some certainty about how government's going to approach that sector. So the idea of the Industrial Strategy Council, which is independent of government, would be to hold the government to account, ensure it's doing what it said it would do, and crucially, to the previous question, providing monitoring and evaluation externally in addition to what we're doing in-house to see if what we said we're doing is actually having an impact or not. So that'll be the big thing. In terms of what we can then say about the sort of scale of support that we're offering businesses, obviously we're in the middle of the spending review process, so I can't give you any guidance on that at the moment. We're working our way through with Treasury colleagues and actually trying to make sure we provide the strongest possible evidence for the impact it would make. But I do caution against sort of measuring the success of an industrial policy by the amount of funding that goes into it. Funding is obviously important. But back to my example on financial services, it's not just about money. And if you look at what the announcement today from the Department for Transport on automotive, what we were doing around the ZEV mandate is just as important, if not more so, for the future success of the automotive industry in the UK as the amount of money we put into R&D.
Thank you. So the focus is going to move to 8 growth-driving sectors, but what will happen to those sectors that aren't included? So sectors like steel or farming?
Yeah, so I think we've said on things like steel that we see those as absolutely crucial foundational sectors to the economy. And on all of this as well, people have always said in industrial policy that we need to make more choices. I think one of the criticisms of the 2017 industrial strategy, which I wrote, not enough choices were made. It was seen, I think one of the criticisms was a bit too much all things for all people. I think what's been interesting from this government has been a much clearer decision to be very clear about where they see the growth potential coming. And those sectors weren't just picked by, if you like, ministerial whim. That was based on joint analysis and evidence from ourselves and Treasury about where productivity and growth has come from in the last decade, forecasts of where growth is likely to come over the next decade, including international markets, revealed comparative advantage, export performance, and that identified the 8 sectors responsible for 30% of GDP, but responsible for 60% of the growth. And what it's saying is not that we don't care about other sectors by any stretch, it's saying that's where we see, if we're trying to come back to the opening question about what success looks like, exports, investment, jobs, higher wages, that's where we see those coming from. But what we'll want to do as part of the wider growth mission is ensure the broader business environment is conducive to growth in all sectors. So we're being very clear about where we'll put our focus around getting the driving exports and investment, because we know that's where the opportunity is. But we'll of course want to make sure that the wider UK environment is a good place for all businesses to prosper.
And have you had response from stakeholders about the development of the industrial strategy, and what are you doing to mitigate concerns?
Well, we've had 27,000 formal responses to the Green Paper. Since the election, we've met with over 130,000 businesses through the department. Secretary of State alone has met with 1,000 businesses. I just say that just to give you a sort of sense of the scale and depth of the engagement. Must admit, had less of sort of concerns at this point, a sense of sort of potential and opportunity. Obviously, of course, You know, some people will be disappointed in terms of what we're able to do for them because government can't do everything. There are limits both in terms of bandwidth, where some of the choices and trade-offs might be, and of course where there's financial investment, the extent of support. What are the common themes coming out from businesses around where they are focused? Obviously, with the geopolitics, they want support around the global trading environment. That might be around reducing frictions, not always free trade agreements, but actually some of the frictions at the border, use of trade digitalisation, some of the partnerships we can do with customs around the world. I think we've touched already on electricity prices, and they are high, and that has implications for business structure. Skills in the Department for Education, making sure that we have the right skills pipeline so we're able to reduce the pressure on the visa system and actually make sure we create good job opportunities for people around the country. Regulation, we've touched on, but I think we know we need to improve regulation. This government has made big changes around the way in which planning law, and that's been taken through Parliament, but planning we know is a big barrier. And finally, capital markets, and I think there's been lots of debate around the London markets, making sure that the capital markets work for UK businesses in the round, be they startups, scale-ups, or the big, broader global corporates. When I was in Davos earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak to a range of global chief execs, and it was interesting what they said about the UK. They said, in terms of why the UK is attractive, they really identified three things: stability and predictability in an incredibly volatile world. I mean, maybe ironic given what's happened in the last decade, but actually at the moment that stability really struck out. Secondly, the fact that we are an open global trading nation. There's no real political constituency for protectionism, and people notice that, and so the UK is seen as a good place to base a global business from. And also the fact that when you think about where growth is going to come from over the next decade, obviously growth shifting to the Far East, growth in creative, education, work around services in particular, the UK is well positioned for that. It's not just services, but we are disproportionately services. And if you look at the growth in exports in services over the last 5 years, UK has actually been incredibly successful, second largest service exporter in the world. But, they all said, but, you make it hard. Mm-hmm. You make it hard to invest here. It's complex. You've got to navigate your way around multiple government departments. It can be expensive, things like electricity prices, and actually quite hard to work your way through things like planning and get access to the right skills. The thing that gives me optimism, though, is a lot of these things are under our control. So if we can get some of those systems right, make it easier to navigate government, simpler to get the right skills and get the right balance on electricity prices and costs and burdens, you can see the potential, but there's real interest in investing in the UK.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I've got one or two questions to finish off, and I'm going to be on my theme for this committee, which is joined up government through digital. And paragraph 2.19 on page 38 of the report says DBT teams are asked to record their interactions with industry following engagement on DBT's data hub. But this does not happen consistently. There are also limitations with the functionality of the system and its usefulness, since it cannot be accessed across departments. This means that teams do not always know whether industry stakeholders have been in contact with other DBT teams or even other departments. Back to our we were discussing this earlier in the hearing. So what more can you do to ensure proper digital joined up between departments, and even recording your own department's interactions with industry?
I mean, literally, it drives me crazy, this stuff, the fact that we've got different digital platforms in different government departments. Absolutely bonkers. What you really want is a single digital architecture across the whole of Whitehall. I think it's fair to say that's where the Cabinet Office is focused on now. I mean, Data Hub works well within the department. So I think that's a good architecture. It's not perfect. I mean, people question whether there's other sort of off-the-shelf platforms we could use, but Data Hub is a solid, good platform for using the sort of broad, large number of interactions with businesses across the world. And people use this. This is not just in the UK, across the world. Back to my opening point, though, it's not just about the technology. It's around getting the incentives right as well. We had great digital platforms in PwC, but not always everyone registered when they were speaking to clients. So you've got to get the incentives right and get some of the training in place, which is what I talked about before. The one thing I've worked on with colleagues in Treasury and Downing Street is around our top accounts. So there are 50 companies that we know will have a disproportionate impact on the growth mission and industrial policy. companies would all, we could all name them here, couldn't we? AstraZeneca, GSK, thinking in life sciences, HSBC. What we put in place is a single account management system. So when senior officials and ministers are speaking to those companies, everyone knows who's talked to whom. We know what the issues of concern are from that company and how they're being progressed, and have a single senior person, both at ministerial and also official level, to own that relationship. So that is a new structure we put in place for this administration, and already we're seeing the values for that for a much more integrated set of conversations.
So this one digital join up across government is an aspiration which now largely sits with DESNES. One of the things...
DCIT.
It's DCIT, sorry, thank you for the correction. One of the things that this committee has been advocating is that we should have a senior digital officer and indeed a senior cyber officer in the top levels of management in every department in order to drive this uniformity across government. Is that something you would consider in your department?
Yeah, and so Tara Smith, my Chief Operating Officer, who was here for the previous evidence session, is looking at this as part of the spending review. And as I mentioned, I want to increase the amount of digital capacity in my department, because you think about the potential for not just basic data sharing, let alone that's before you get to AI.
Do you have many legacy systems, and are you taking steps to replace those?
Yeah, so over the last 2 years, part of the machinery of government, we had to bring everyone onto the same digital platform because the BASE system and the DIT system didn't meet. So over the last 18 months, that's exactly what we've been doing. Now everyone is now on the same system with the same SharePoint system, so everyone can access everyone's data within the department. But that's, as I call it, the foundation level. There's a lot more we want to be able to do to build off from that.
Given that you handle a lot of data, you will have systems that are compatible with using AI, whatever comes
so
up.
for example, already we're piloting things like Copilot, the Microsoft Copilot. We have Redbox, which is enabling ministers to, rather than having all the paperwork for their box in the evening, actually can interrogate that through a secure LLM environment.
Very good. Final question. Paragraph 3.7 on page 43. GDP growth. It's been lower than the G7 average. So on average, 1.6% per annum between 2014-24, but the G7 in that period has had a growth of 1.8%. So if we have you back in the committee in 2 or 3 years' time, will it be a success or a failure if you haven't managed to get to the G7 levels of growth?
Failure.
Sorry?
Failure.
Failure.
Yeah. It'll be a failure if we haven't been able to improve our growth rate and get up to the G7 ranking.
Yeah, on the record. Thank you very much indeed for that very candid and very clear answer. Can I thank all our witnesses very much today. An uncorrected version of the transcript will be available in the coming days, following which we will produce a report with recommendations. And thank you again. It's been a very interesting session, and we've covered a lot of ground. So